You are about to hear the complete, unabridged story of the grandfather of all spy thrillers, The 39 Steps. It starts with a bored man in London who returns home to find a stranger dead in his apartment. Suddenly, he is the most wanted man in Britain. But who killed the stranger? And what exactly are the 39 steps? You'll have to listen to find out. This video is designed to help you rest. It pairs mystery with deep red spectrum visuals to protect your melatonin levels, and a soothing narration to help you drift off. So, lie back, close your eyes, and if you enjoy falling asleep to classics, please like this video and subscribe for more bedtime stories. The 39 Steps. Chapter 1: The Man Who Died. I returned from the city around 3 o'clock on that May afternoon, pretty well disgusted with life. I had been in the old country for 3 months, and I was fed up with it. If anyone had told me a year ago that I would be feeling this way, I would have laughed at him. But there was the fact. The weather made me irritable, and the talk of the ordinary Englishman made me sick. I couldn't get enough exercise, and the amusements of London seemed as flat as soda water that had been standing in the sun. Richard Hannay, I kept telling myself, you have got into the wrong ditch, my friend, and you had better climb out. It made me bite my lip to think of the plans I had built up during those last years in Bulawayo. I had made my pile, not a vast fortune, but good enough for me, and I had figured out all kinds of ways to enjoy myself. My father had brought me out from Scotland at the age of 6, and I had never been home since. England was a sort of Arabian Nights to me, and I counted on staying there for the rest of my days. But from the very first, I was disappointed. In about a week I was tired of seeing sights, and in less than a month I had had enough of restaurants, theatres, and race meetings. I had no real friend to go about with, which probably explains things. Plenty of people invited me to their houses, but they didn't seem much interested in me. They would fling me a question or two about South Africa, and then get back to their own affairs. A lot of imperialist ladies asked me to tea to meet schoolmasters from New Zealand and editors from Vancouver, and that was the most dismal business of all. Here I was, 37 years old, fit and healthy, with enough money to have a good time, yet yawning my head off all day. I had just about decided to clear out and get back to the veldt, for I was the most bored man in the United Kingdom. That afternoon I had been pestering my brokers about investments, just to give my mind something to work on. On my way home I turned into my club, a rather second-rate place which took in colonial members. I had a long drink and read the evening papers. They were full of trouble in the Near East, and there was an article about Karolides, the Greek premier. I rather fancied the chap. From all accounts, he seemed the one big man in the show, and he played a straight game, which was more than could be said for most of them. I gathered they hated him in Berlin and Vienna, but that we were going to stick by him. One paper said he was the only barrier between Europe and Armageddon. I remember wondering if I could get a job in those parts. It struck me that Albania was the sort of place that might keep a man from yawning. About 6 o'clock I went home, dressed, dined at the Café Royal, and turned into a music hall. It was a silly show, and I did not stay long. The night was fine and clear as I walked back to the flat I had hired near Portland Place. The crowd surged past me on the pavement, busy and chattering, and I envied the people for having something to do. These shop-girls and clerks and policemen had some interest in life that kept them going. I gave a coin to a beggar because I saw him yawn. He was a fellow-sufferer. At Oxford Circus I looked up into the spring sky and made a vow. I would give the old country another day to give me a purpose. If nothing happened, I would take the next boat for the Cape. My flat was on the first floor in a new block behind Langham Place. There was a common staircase, with a porter and a liftman at the entrance, but no restaurant, and each flat was quite shut off from the others. I hate servants on the premises, so I had a man to look after me who came in that day. He arrived before 8 every morning and departed at 7, for I never dined at home. I was just fitting my key into the door when I noticed a man at my elbow. I had not seen him approach, and his sudden appearance made me start. He was a slim man, with a short brown beard and small, piercing blue eyes. I recognized him as the occupant of a flat on the top floor, with whom I had exchanged greetings on the stairs. "Can I speak to you?" he said. "May I come in for a minute?" He was steadying his voice with an effort, and his hand clutched my arm. I opened the door and motioned him in. No sooner was he over the threshold than he made a dash for my back room, where I used to smoke and write letters. Then he bolted back. "Is the door locked?" he asked feverishly, and he fastened the chain with his own hand. "I'm very sorry," he said humbly. "It's a huge liberty, but you looked the kind of man who would understand. I've had you in my mind all this week while things were getting troublesome. Say, will you do me a favor?" "I'll listen to you," I said. "That's all I'll promise." I was getting worried by the antics of this nervous little chap. There was a tray of drinks on a table beside him. He poured himself a stiff whiskey and soda, drank it in 3 gulps, and cracked the glass as he set it down. "Pardon," he said. "I'm a bit rattled tonight. You see, I happen to be dead at this moment." I sat down in an armchair and lit my pipe. "What does it feel like?" I asked. I was pretty certain I was dealing with a madman. A smile flickered over his drawn face. "I'm not mad yet. Say, sir, I've been watching you, and I reckon you're a cool customer. I reckon, too, you're an honest man, and not afraid of playing a bold hand. I'm going to confide in you. I need help worse than any man ever needed it." "Get on with your story," I said, "and then I'll tell you." He seemed to brace himself for a great effort, and started on the queerest tale. I didn't quite catch it at first, and I had to stop and ask him questions. But here is the gist of it. He was an American, from Kentucky. After college, being pretty well off, he had started out to see the world. He wrote a bit, acted as a war correspondent for a Chicago paper, and spent a year or 2 in southeastern Europe. I gathered he was a fine linguist, and knew the society in those parts well. He spoke familiarly of many names I had seen in the newspapers. He had played with politics, he told me, first for the interest of it, and then because he couldn't help himself. I read him as a sharp, restless fellow who always wanted to get down to the roots of things. He got a little further down than he wanted. I am giving you what he told me as well as I could make it out. Away behind all the governments and the armies there was a big underground movement going on, engineered by very dangerous people. He had come across it by accident. It fascinated him. He went deeper, and then he got caught. I gathered that most of the people involved were the sort of educated anarchists who make revolutions, but beside them were financiers playing strictly for money. A clever man can make big profits on a falling market, and it suited the agenda of both classes to set Europe at its own throat. He told me queer things that explained a lot that had puzzled me, things that happened in the Balkan War, why alliances were made and broken, why certain men disappeared, and where the sinews of war came from. The aim of the whole conspiracy was to get Russia and Germany at loggerheads. When I asked why, he said the anarchist lot thought it would give them their chance. Everything would be in the melting pot, and they looked to see a new world emerge. The capitalists would rake in the profits and make fortunes by buying up the wreckage. Capital, he said, had no conscience and no fatherland. He claimed the financiers were behind it all, seeking vengeance. "Do you wonder?" he cried. "For 300 years they have been persecuted, and this is the return match." He went on to describe how these men worked from the shadows, ruling the world from behind the scenes, holding grudges against the empire of the Tsar. I could not help saying that his anarchists seemed to have been left behind a little. "Yes and no," he said. "They succeeded up to a point, but they struck a bigger thing than money, a thing that couldn't be bought, the old elemental fighting instincts of man. If you're going to be killed, you invent some kind of flag and country to fight for, and if you survive, you get to love the thing. Those soldiers have found something they care for, and that has upset the pretty plan laid in Berlin and Vienna. But my friends haven't played their last card. They've got an ace up their sleeves, and unless I can keep alive for a month, they are going to play it and win." "But I thought you were dead," I put in. "Mors janua vitae. Death is the gate of life," he smiled. "I'm coming to that, but I've got to put you wise to a lot of things first. If you read your newspaper, I guess you know the name of Constantine Karolides." I sat up at that, for I had been reading about him that very afternoon. "He is the man who has wrecked all their games. He is the one big brain in the whole show, and he also happens to be an honest man. Therefore, he has been marked for death these 12 months. I found that out. But I also found out the way they were going to get him, and that knowledge was deadly. That's why I have had to die." He had another drink, and I mixed it for him myself, for I was getting interested in the beggar. They can't get him in his own land, for he has a bodyguard that would skin their grandmothers. But on the 15th of June he is coming to this city. The British Foreign Office has taken to having international tea parties, and the biggest of them is due on that date. Now, Karolides is considered the principal guest, and if my friends have their way, he will never return home. "That's simple enough," I said. "You can warn him and keep him at home." "And play their game?" he asked sharply. "If he does not come, they win, for he's the only man that can straighten out the tangle. And if his government is warned he won't come, for he does not know how big the stakes will be on June the 15th. "What about the British government?" I said. "They're not going to let their guests be murdered. Tip them off, and they'll take extra precautions." "No good. They might stuff your city with detectives and double the police, and Constantine would still be a doomed man. My friends are not playing for small stakes. They want a big occasion for the assassination, with the eyes of all Europe on it. He'll be murdered by an Austrian, and there'll be plenty of evidence to show the connivance of the big folk in Vienna and Berlin. It will all be an infernal lie, of course, but the case will look black enough to the world. I'm not talking about hot air, my friend. I happen to know every detail of the hellish machine, and I can tell you it will be the most finished piece of villainy since the Borgias. But it's not going to come off if there is a certain man alive right here in London on the 15th day of June who knows the inner wheels of the business. And that man is going to be your servant, Franklin P. Scudder. I was getting to like the little chap. His jaw was set like a rat trap, and there was the fire of battle in those gimlety eyes. If he was spinning me a yarn, he certainly knew how to act the part. "Where did you find out this story?" I asked. "I got the first hint in an inn in Tyrol," he said. "That made me inquire. I collected my other clues in a fur shop in Buda, a strangers' club in Vienna, and a little bookshop in Leipzig. I completed my evidence 10 days ago in Paris." He paused for breath. "I can't tell you the details now, for it's a long history. When I was quite sure in my own mind, I judged it my business to disappear, and I reached this city by a mighty queer route. I left Paris as a dandified young French-American. I sailed from Hamburg as a Jewish diamond merchant. In Norway, I was an English student of Ibsen collecting materials for lectures, but when I left Bergen I was a film man with special ski footage. And I came here from Scotland with a lot of wood pulp deals in my pocket to put before the London newspapers. Until yesterday, I thought I had covered my tracks. I was feeling pretty happy. Then the recollection seemed to upset him, and he gulped down more whiskey. Then I saw a man standing in the street outside this block. I used to stay close in my room all day, and only slip out after dark for an hour or two. I watched him for a bit from my window, and I thought I recognized him. He came in and spoke to the porter. When I came back from my walk last night, I found a card in my letterbox. It bore the name of the man I want least to meet on God's earth. The look in my companion's eyes, the sheer naked fear on his face, convinced me of his honesty. My own voice sharpened a bit as I asked him what he did next. I realized that I was trapped, he said. There was only one way out. I had to die. If my pursuers knew I was dead, they would go to sleep again. How did you manage it? I told my valet that I was feeling pretty bad, and I made myself look like death. That wasn't difficult, for I'm no slouch at disguises. Then I got a corpse. You can always get a body in London if you know where to go for it. I fetched it back in a trunk on the top of a cab, and I had to be assisted upstairs to my room. You see, I had to pile up evidence for the inquest. I went to bed and got my man to mix me a sleeping draught, and then told him to clear out. He wanted to fetch a doctor, but I swore and said I couldn't stand them. When I was left alone, I started to fake that corpse. He was my size, and I judged he had perished from too much alcohol, so I put some spirits handy about the place. The jaw was the weak point in the likeness, so I blew it away with a revolver. I dare say someone will swear they heard a shot tomorrow, but there are no neighbours on my floor, so I risked it. I left the body in bed, dressed in my pyjamas, with a revolver lying on the sheets and a considerable mess around. Then I changed into a suit I had kept waiting for emergencies. I didn't dare shave for fear of leaving tracks, and besides, it wasn't any use trying to get into the streets. I had had you in my mind all day, and there seemed nothing to do but appeal to you. I watched from my window until I saw you come home, and then slipped down the stairs to meet you. There, sir, I guess you know about as much as me about this business." He sat blinking like an owl, fluttering with nerves yet desperately determined. By this time I was convinced he was playing straight with me. It was a wild narrative, but I had heard many steep tales in my time that turned out to be true. I made a practice of judging the man rather than the story. If he had wanted to get into my flat to cut my throat, he would have pitched a milder story. "Hand me your key," I said, "and I'll take a look at the corpse. Excuse my caution, but I have to verify this." He shook his head mournfully. "I reckoned you'd ask for that, but I haven't got it. It's on my chain on the dressing-table. I had to leave it behind, for I couldn't leave any clues to breed suspicion. The men who are after me are sharp. You'll have to take me on trust for the night, and tomorrow you'll get proof of the corpse business right enough." I thought for a moment. "Right. I'll trust you for the night. I'll lock you into this room and keep the key. Just one word, Mr. Scudder. I believe you're honest, but if you aren't, I should warn you that I'm handy with a gun." "Sure," he said, jumping up briskly. "I haven't the privilege of your name, sir, but let me tell you that you're a decent man. I'll thank you for lending me a razor." I took him into my bedroom and turned him loose. In half an hour a figure came out that I scarcely recognized. Only his gimlet, hungry eyes were the same. He was shaved clean, his hair was parted in the middle, and he had cut his eyebrows. He carried himself as if he had been drilled, and was the very model, even to the tanned complexion, of a British officer who had had a long spell in India. He even had a monocle stuck in his eye, and every trace of American accent was gone. "My hat, Mr. Scudder," I stammered. "Not Mr. Scudder," he corrected. "Captain Theophilus Digby, of the 40th Gurkhas, presently home on leave." "I'll thank you for remembering that, sir." I made him a bed in my smoking-room and went to sleep, more cheerful than I had been for the past month. Things did happen occasionally, even in this God-forgotten metropolis. I woke up the next morning to hear my man, Paddock, making a racket at the smoking-room door. Paddock was a fellow I had done a good turn for out in Africa, and I had hired him as my servant as soon as I got to England. He had about as much gift of gab as a hippopotamus, and was not a great valet, but I knew I could count on his loyalty. "Stop that noise, Paddock," I said. "There's a friend of mine, Captain Digby, sleeping in there. Get breakfast for two, and then come speak to me." I told Paddock a story about how my friend was a wealthy man with nerves bad from overwork, who needed absolute rest. No one was to know he was here, or he would be besieged by communications from the government. Scudder played up splendidly at breakfast. He fixed Paddock with his eyeglass, just like a British officer, asked him about the Boer War, and tossed out a lot of stories about imaginary friends. Paddock couldn't learn to call me sir, but he stirred Scudder as if his life depended on it. I left him with the newspaper and a box of cigars, and went down to the city until luncheon. When I got back, the liftman had a serious look on his face. "Nasty business here this morning, sir. The gentleman in number 15 went and shot himself. They've just taken him to the mortuary. The police are up there now." I went up to number 15 and found a couple of policemen and an inspector busy examining the scene. I asked a few idiotic questions, and they soon kicked me out. Then I found Scudder's valet and questioned him, but I could see he suspected nothing. He was a whining fellow with a grim face, and a few coins went far to console him. I attended the inquest the next day. A partner of a publishing firm gave evidence that the deceased had brought him wood pulp deals and had been an agent of an American business. The jury found it a case of suicide while of unsound mind, and his effects were handed over to the American consul. I gave Scudder a full account of the affair, and it interested him greatly. He said he wished he could have attended, as reading one's own obituary would be quite spicy. The first 2 days he stayed with me in the back room. He was very peaceful. He read, smoked, and made notes in a book. Every night we played chess, at which he beat me soundly. I think he was nursing his nerves back to health. But on the 3rd day, I could see he was becoming restless. He made a list of the days until June 15th and ticked each off with a red pencil. I would find him lost in deep thought, and after those spells of meditation, he was apt to be very despondent. Then he began to get edgy again. He listened for little noises and kept asking if Paddock could be trusted. Once or twice he got very peevish and apologized for it. I didn't blame him. I made every allowance, for he had taken on a stiff job. It was not the safety of his own skin that troubled him, but the success of the scheme he had planned. That little man was pure grit all through. One night he was very solemn. "Say, Hannay," he said, dropping the accent, "I reckon I should let you a bit deeper into this business. I should hate to go out without leaving somebody else to put up a fight." He began to tell me in detail what I had only heard vaguely. I did not give him very close attention. The fact is, I was more interested in his adventures than in his high politics. I reckoned that Carolides and his affairs were not my business, so a lot of what he said slipped out of my memory. I remember he was very clear that the danger to Carolides would not begin until he reached London, and would come from the very highest quarters. He mentioned the name of a woman, Julia Czechenyi, as having something to do with it. She would be the decoy to get Carolides away from his guards. He talked, too, about a black stone and a man who lisped, and he described someone he never referred to without a shudder, an old man with a young voice who could hood his eyes like a hawk. He spoke a good deal about death, too. He was anxious about finishing his job, but he didn't care about the rush for his life. I reckon it's like going to sleep when you are tired out, and waking to find a summer day with the scent of hay coming in the window. I used to thank God for such mornings back in Kentucky, and I guess I'll thank him when I wake up on the other side of Jordan. The next day he was much more cheerful. I went out to dinner with a mining engineer and came back about 10:30, in time for our game of chess. I had a cigar in my mouth as I pushed open the smoking-room door. The lights were not lit, which struck me as odd. I wondered if Scudder had gone to sleep already. I snapped the switch, but there was nobody there. Then I saw something in the far corner which made me drop my cigar and fall into a cold sweat. My guest was lying sprawled on his back. There was a long knife through his heart which skewered him to the floor. Chapter 2. The Milkman sets out on his travels. I sat down in an armchair and felt very sick. That lasted for maybe 5 minutes, and was succeeded by a fit of the horrors. The poor staring white face on the floor was more than I could bear, and I managed to get a tablecloth and cover it. Then I staggered to a cupboard, found the brandy, and swallowed several mouthfuls. I had seen men die violently before. Indeed, I had killed a few myself in the Matabele War. But this cold-blooded indoor business was different. Still, I managed to pull myself together. I looked at my watch and saw that it was 10:30. An idea seized me, and I went over the flat with a fine-tooth comb. There was nobody there, nor any trace of anybody, but I shuttered and bolted all the windows and put the chain on the door. By this time my wits were coming back to me, and I could think again. It took me about an hour to figure the thing out, and I did not hurry. Unless the murderer came back, I had until about 6 o'clock in the morning for my cogitations. I was in the soup. That was pretty clear. Any shadow of a doubt I might have had about the truth of Scudder's tale was now gone. The proof of it was lying under the tablecloth. The men who knew that he knew what he knew had found him, and had taken the best way to make certain of his silence. Yes, but he had been in my room for 4 days, and his enemies must have reckoned that he had confided in me. So I would be the next to go. It might be that very night, or next day, or the day after, but my number was up all right. Then suddenly I thought of another probability. Supposing I went out now and called in the police, or went to bed and let Paddock find the body and called them in the morning. What kind of a story was I to tell about Scudder? I had lied to Paddock about him, and the whole thing looked desperately fishy. If I made a clean breast of it and told the police everything he had told me, they would simply laugh at me. The odds were 1,000 to 1 that I would be charged with the murder, and the circumstantial evidence was strong enough to hang me. Few people knew me in England. I had no real friend who could come forward and swear to my character. Perhaps that was what those secret enemies were playing for. They were clever enough for anything, and an English prison was as good a way of getting rid of me until after June 15th as a knife in my chest. Besides, if I told the whole story, and by any miracle was believed, I would be playing their game. Carolides would stay at home, which was what they wanted. Somehow or other, the sight of Scudder's dead face had made me a passionate believer in his scheme. He was gone, but he had taken me into his confidence, and I was pretty well bound to carry on his work. You may think this ridiculous for a man in danger of his life, but that was the way I looked at it. I am an ordinary sort of fellow, not braver than other people, but I hate to see a good man downed. That long knife would not be the end of Scudder if I could play the game in his place. It took me an hour or two to think this out, and by that time I had come to a decision. I must vanish somehow, and keep vanishing until the end of the second week in June. Then I must find a way to get in touch with the government people and tell them what Scudder had told me. I wished to heaven he had told me more, and that I had listened more carefully to the little he had told me. I knew nothing but the barest facts. There was a big risk that, even if I weathered the other dangers, I would not be believed in the end. I must take my chance of that, and hope that something might happen which would confirm my tale in the eyes of the government. My first job was to keep going for the next 3 weeks. It was now the 24th day of May, and that meant 20 days of hiding before I could venture to approach the powers that be. I reckoned that 2 sets of people would be looking for me, Scudder's enemies to put me out of existence, and the police, who would want me for Scudder's murder. It was going to be a giddy hunt, and it was queer how the prospect comforted me. I had been slacking for so long that almost any chance of activity was welcome. When I had to sit alone with that corpse and wait on fortune, I was no better than a crushed worm. But if my next safety was to hang on my own wits, I was prepared to be cheerful about it. My next thought was whether Scudder had any papers about him to give me a better clue to the business. I drew back the tablecloth and searched his pockets, for I no longer shrank from the body. The face was wonderfully calm for a man who had been struck down in a moment. There was nothing in the breast pocket, and only a few loose coins and a cigar-holder in the waistcoat. The trousers held a little penknife and some silver, and the side pocket of his jacket contained an old crocodile-skin cigar-case. There was no sign of the little black book in which I had seen him making notes. That had no doubt been taken by his murderer. But as I looked up from my task, I saw that some drawers had been pulled out in the writing-table. Scudder would never have left them in that state, for he was the tiddiest of mortals. Someone must have been searching for something, perhaps for the pocket-book. I went round the flat and found that everything had been ransacked, the inside of books, drawers, cupboards, boxes, even the pockets of the clothes in my wardrobe. There was no trace of the book. Most likely the enemy had found it, but they had not found it on Scudder's body. Then I got out an atlas and looked at a big map of the British Isles. My notion was to get off to some wild district where my Weltkraft would be of some use to me, for I would be like a trapped rat in a city. I considered that Scotland would be best, for my people were Scotch, and I could pass anywhere as an ordinary Scotsman. I had half an idea at first to be a German tourist, for my father had had German partners, and I had been brought up to speak the tongue pretty fluently, not to mention having put in 3 years prospecting for copper in German Dammerland. But I calculated that it would be less conspicuous to be a Scot, and less in line with what the police might know of my past. I fixed on Galloway as the best place to go. It was the nearest wild part of Scotland, so far as I could figure it out, and from the look of the map was not over thick with population. A search in the railway guide informed me that a train left St. Pancras at 7:10, which would land me at any Galloway station in the late afternoon. That was well enough, but a more important matter was how I was to make my way to St. Pancras, for I was pretty certain that Scudder's friends would be watching outside. This puzzled me for a bit. Then I had an inspiration, on which I went to bed and slept for 2 troubled hours. I got up at 4 and opened my bedroom shutters. The faint light of a fine summer morning was flooding the skies, and the sparrows had begun to chatter. I had a great revulsion of feeling, and felt like a God-forgotten fool. My inclination was to let things slide, and trust the British police taking a reasonable view of my case. But as I reviewed the situation, I could find no arguments to bring against my decision of the previous night, so with a wry mouth I resolved to go on with my plan. I was not feeling in any particular funk, only disinclined to go looking for trouble, if you understand me. I hunted out a well-used tweed suit, a pair of strong nailed boots, and a flannel shirt with a collar. Into my pockets I stuffed a spare shirt, a cloth cap, some handkerchiefs, and a toothbrush. I had drawn a good sum in gold from the bank 2 days before, in case Scudder wanted money, and I took £50 of it in sovereigns in a belt which I had brought back from Rhodesia. That was about all I wanted. Then I had a bath, and cut my moustache, which was long and drooping, into a short stubbly fringe. Now comes the next step. Paddock used to arrive punctually at 7:30 and let himself in with a latch key. But about 20 minutes to 7, as I knew from bitter experience, the milkman turned up with a great clatter of cans and deposited my share outside my door. I had seen that milkman sometimes when I had gone out for an early ride. He was a young man about my own height, with a thin moustache, and he wore a white overall. On him I staked all my chances. I went into the darkened smoking room, where the rays of morning light were beginning to creep through the shutters. There I breakfasted off a whisky and soda and some biscuits from the cupboard. By this time it was getting on for 6 o'clock. I put a pipe in my pocket and filled my pouch from the tobacco jar on the table by the fireplace. As I poked into the tobacco my fingers touched something hard, and I drew out Scudder's little black pocket-book. That seemed to me a good omen. I lifted the cloth from the body, and was amazed at the peace and dignity of the dead face. "Good-bye, old chap," I said. "I am going to do my best for you. Wish me well, wherever you are." Then I hung about in the hall waiting for the milkman. That was the worst part of the business, for I was fairly choking to get out of doors. 6:30 passed, then 6:40, but still he did not come. The fool had chosen this day of all days to be late. At 1 minute after 6:45 I heard the rattle of the cans outside. I opened the front door, and there was my man, singling out my cans from a bunch he carried and whistling through his teeth. He jumped a bit at the sight of me. "Come in here for a moment," I said. "I want a word with you." I led him into the dining-room. "I reckon you're a bit of a sportsman," I said, "and I want you to do me a service. Lend me your cap and overall for 10 minutes, and here's a sovereign for you." His eyes opened at the sight of the gold, and he grinned broadly. "What's the jime?" he asked. "A bet," I said. "I haven't time to explain, but to win it I've got to be a milkman for the next 10 minutes. All you've got to do is to stay here till I come back. You'll be a bit late, but nobody will complain, and you'll have that quid for yourself." "Right-o," he said cheerily. "I ain't the man to spoil a bit of sport. S the rig, governor." I stuck on his flat blue hat and his white overall, picked up the cans, banged my door, and went whistling downstairs. The porter at the foot told me to shut my jaw, which sounded as if my make-up was adequate. At first I thought there was nobody in the street. Then I caught sight of a policeman 100 yards down, and a loafer shuffling past on the other side. Some impulse made me raise my eyes to the house opposite, and there at a first-floor window was a face. As the loafer passed he looked up, and I fancied a signal was exchanged. I crossed the street, whistling gaily and imitating the jaunty swing of the milkman. Then I took the first side street, and went up a left-hand turn which led past a bit of vacant ground. There was no one in the little street, so I dropped the milk cans inside the fence and sent the cap and overall after them. I had only just put on my cloth cap when a postman came round the corner. I gave him good morning, and he answered me unsuspiciously. At that moment the clock of a neighbouring church struck the hour of 7. There was not a second to spare. As soon as I got to Euston Road, I took to my heels and ran. The clock at Euston Station showed 5 minutes past the hour. At St. Pancras I had no time to take a ticket, let alone that I had not settled upon my destination. A porter told me the platform, and as I entered it I saw the train already in motion. 2 station officials blocked the way, but I dodged them and clambered into the last carriage. 3 minutes later, as we were roaring through the northern tunnels, an irate guard interviewed me. He wrote out a ticket to Newton Stewart, a name which had suddenly come back to my memory, and he conducted me from the first-class compartment where I had ensconced myself to a third-class smoker, occupied by a sailor and a stout woman with a child. He went off grumbling, and as I mopped my brow I observed to my companions in my broadest Scots that it was a sore job catching trains. I had already entered upon my part. "The impudence o' that guard," said the lady bitterly. "He needed a Scotch tongue to put him in his place." He was complaining o' this wean no having a ticket and her no for till August 12-month, and he was objecting to this gentleman spitting. The sailor morosely agreed, and I started my new life in an atmosphere of protest against authority. I reminded myself that a week ago I had been finding the world dull. Chapter 3: The Adventure of the Literary Innkeeper. I had a solemn journey north. It was fine May weather, with hawthorn flowering on every hedge, and I asked myself why, while I was still a free man, I hadn't stayed to enjoy this heavenly country. I didn't dare face the restaurant car, so I bought a lunch basket at Leeds and shared it with a large woman opposite. I also read the morning papers, news about the Derby, the start of the cricket season, and reports that Balkan affairs were settling down. When I had finished with the news, I took out Scudder's little black pocket-book. It was filled with jottings, mostly figures, though occasionally a name appeared. Hofgaard, Luneville, and avocado occurred often, and especially the word Pavia. I knew Scudder never did anything without a reason. There had to be a cipher here. Codes have always interested me. I did a bit of intelligence work at Delagoa Bay during the Boer War, and I have a head for puzzles. This looked like a numerical cipher where figures correspond to letters. But a shrewd man can usually crack those in an hour, and I didn't think Scudder would use something so simple. So I focused on the printed words. You can make a strong numerical cipher if a keyword dictates the letter sequence. I tried for hours, but none of the words worked. I fell asleep, waking at Dumfries just in time to scramble out and catch the slow Galloway train. There was a man on the platform whose look I didn't like, but he never glanced at me. Catching my reflection in a station mirror, I didn't wonder why. With my brown face, old tweeds, and slouch, I looked exactly like the hill farmers crowding the third-class carriages. I travelled with 6 of them in air thick with pipe smoke. They were returning from the market, mouths full of prices. I heard accounts of lambing seasoning up the cairn and other mysterious waters. Half the men smelled strongly of whisky and took no notice of me. We rumbled slowly into a land of wooded glens and wide moorland, gleaming with lochs, high blue hills rising to the north. By 5 o'clock the carriage had emptied and I was alone. I got out at a small station in the heart of a bog. It reminded me of those forgotten stops in the African Karoo. An old station-master digging in his garden walked over, took a parcel from the train, and went back to his potatoes. A child took my ticket, and I stepped onto a white road straggling over the brown moor. It was a gorgeous spring evening. Every hill stood clear as cut amethyst. The air held the rooty smell of bogs, fresh as mid-ocean, and it lifted my spirits. I felt light-hearted, like a boy on a spring holiday, not a man of 37 wanted by the police. I felt as I used to when starting a big trek on the high veldt. I actually swung along that road whistling. I had no plan, only a desire to go on in this honest hill country. Every mile put me in a better mood. I cut a hazel walking stick and turned up a path following a rushing stream. I reckoned I was far ahead of any pursuit. Hungry after hours without food, I found a shepherd's cottage nestled by a waterfall. A shy woman welcomed me. She offered a bed in the loft and set down a hearty meal of ham, eggs, scones, and thick sweet milk. At dusk, her husband came in from the hills, a lean giant with a massive stride. They asked no questions, showing the natural breeding of wild places. I let them think I was a cattle dealer, talking of local markets until I was nodding in my chair. The loft bed received a weary man who didn't open his eyes until 5 o'clock the next morning. They refused payment. By 6, I had breakfast and was striding south again. My plan was to double back to the railway line, a station or two beyond where I'd arrived. The police would assume I was fleeing west. I still had a good start. It would take hours to identify me as the man who boarded the train at St. Pancras. The weather remained clear and jolly. I simply could not feel worried. Walking over a long ridge, skirting a high hill called Cairnsmore of Fleet, I felt better than I had in months. Curlews and plovers cried everywhere. Young lambs dotted the green pastures. The slackness of past months slipped away. Eventually, I reached a swell of moorland dipping toward a river and saw the distant smoke of a train. The station was ideal. The moor surged around it, leaving room only for the single track, a siding, and a station-master's cottage with a tiny garden. There seemed to be no road to it. To increase the desolation, a grey tarn lapped against granite stones half a mile away. I waited in the deep heather until I saw an eastbound train on the horizon, then bought a ticket for Dumfries. The carriage's only other occupants were an old shepherd and his dog, a war-lead brute I mistrusted. The man was asleep, leaving that morning's Scotsman on the seat. I seized it eagerly. It held 2 columns on the Portland Place murder. My man Paddock had raised the alarm. The milkman had been arrested but released, and the police believed the true criminal had fled north. A short note mentioned me as the flat owner, a clumsy trick to make me think I wasn't suspected. There was nothing else in the paper about foreign politics or Scudder's interests. I put it down as we approached the station where I'd disembarked yesterday. The gardening station-master had been stirred into activity. A westbound train waited to let us pass, and 3 men had descended from it. I guessed they were local police, tracing me to this remote siding. Watching from the shadows, I saw one taking notes. The child who'd taken my ticket spoke volubly, pointing across the moor. I hoped they would follow my tracks there. As we pulled away, my companion woke. He kicked his dog and asked where he was. Clearly, he was drunk. "That's what comes from being a teetotaler," he said bitterly. I expressed surprise. "Aye, but I'm a strong teetotaler," he argued. "Took the pledge last Martinmas and haven't touched whiskey since. Not even at New Year's, though I was sorely tempted." He buried his head in the cushions. "And this is what I get. A head hotter than hellfire, and 2 eyes looking different ways for the Sabbath. What caused it?" I asked. Brandy. Being a teetotaler, I kept off the whiskey, but I was sipping brandy all day. I doubt I'll be well for a fortnight. He fell back asleep. My plan was to exit further down the line, but the train stopped unexpectedly at a culvert spanning a dark river. Seeing no one, I opened the door and dropped into the hazel bushes. It would have been fine, but for that infernal dog. Thinking I was stealing his master's gear, he barked and nearly grabbed my trousers. This woke the shepherd, who shouted that I'd committed suicide. I crawled through the thicket to the stream's edge. Peering back, I saw the guard and passengers staring at the open door. I couldn't have made a more public departure if I'd hired a brass band. Happily, the drunk provided a diversion. He and his dog tumbled out of the carriage and rolled down the bank. In the rescue that followed, the dog bit someone. I heard hard swearing. By the time I ventured a look, the train was vanishing into the distance. I stood in a wide semicircle of moorland, high hills to the north. There was no sign of human life, only plashing water and crying birds. Yet, for the first time, I felt the terror of the hunted. I didn't fear the police, but the others, those who knew I held Scudder's secret. They would pursue me with a vigilance unknown to British law. I looked back at the peaceful landscape, the sun glinting on the rails and wet stones. Nevertheless, I ran, crouching in the bog channels until sweat blinded me. I didn't stop until I reached the mountain rim and collapsed high above the river. From my vantage point, I scanned the whole moor, right down to the railway line and the green fields south of it. I have hawk-like eyes, but I saw nothing moving in the whole countryside. Then I looked east beyond the ridge to a new landscape, shallow green valleys, fir plantations, and the faint lines of dust that indicated high roads. Finally, I looked up into the blue May sky and saw something that set my pulse racing. Low in the south, a monoplane was climbing into the heavens. I knew with absolute certainty that the plane was looking for me, and that it didn't belong to the police. 4 hours, I watched it from a pit of heather. It flew low along the hilltops, then circled over the valley I had just travelled. Eventually, it seemed to change its mind, rose to a great height, and flew back south. I didn't like this espionage from the air. It made me think less of the countryside I had chosen for refuge. These heather hills offered no cover if my enemies were in the sky. I needed a different kind of sanctuary. I looked with more satisfaction toward the green country beyond the ridge, where I would find woods and stone houses. About 6 that evening, I came out of the moorland onto a white ribbon of road winding through a narrow vale. As I followed it, the glen became a plateau, and presently I reached a pass where a solitary house smoked in the twilight. The road swung over a bridge. Leaning on the parapet was a young man. He was smoking a long clay pipe and studying the water through spectacles. In his left hand he held a small book. Slowly he read aloud, as when a griffin through the wilderness with winged step, o'er hill and moory dale pursues the Arimaspian. He jumped as my step rang on the stone. I saw a pleasant, sunburnt, boyish face. "Good evening," he said gravely. "It's a fine night for the road." The smell of peat smoke and a savoury roast floated from the house. "Is that place an inn?" I asked. "At your service. I am the landlord, sir, and I hope you will stay the night. To tell you the truth, I haven't had company for a week." I pulled myself up on the bridge parapet to fill my pipe. I began to detect an ally. "You're young to be an innkeeper," I said. "My father died a year ago and left me the business. It's a slow job, and not my choice of profession." "What was your choice?" He actually blushed. "I want to write books," he said. "And what better chance could you ask?" I replied, "I've often thought an innkeeper would make the best storyteller in the world." "Not now," he said eagerly. "Maybe in the old days of highwaymen and mail coaches. But now, nothing comes here but tourists stopping for lunch and the occasional fisherman. I want to see life, travel the world, and write like Kipling or Conrad." I looked at the inn, standing golden in the sunset against the brown hills. "I've knocked about the world a bit, and I wouldn't despise such a hermitage. Do you think adventure is found only in the tropics? Maybe you're rubbing shoulders with it at this moment." "That's what Kipling says," he replied, eyes brightening. "Here's a true tale for you then," I said. "A month from now you can make a novel out of it." Sitting on the bridge in the soft May gloaming, I pitched him a lovely yarn. It was true in essentials, though I altered the details. I claimed to be a mining magnate from Kimberley who had exposed a diamond smuggling gang. I told him they had pursued me across the ocean, killed my best friend, and were now on my tracks. I told the story well. I pictured a flight across the Kalahari Desert, and I made a really horrid affair of the Portland Place murder. "You're looking for adventure," I said. "Well, you've found it. The devils are after me, and the police are after them. It's a race I mean to win." "By God!" he whispered. "It is pure Rider Haggard and Conan Doyle. You believe me?" "Of course I do." He held out his hand. "I believe everything out of the ordinary. The only thing to distrust is the normal." He was very young, but he was exactly the man I needed. "I think they're off my track for the moment, but I must lie low for a couple of days. Can you take me in?" He caught my elbow and drew me toward the house. "You'll be as snug here as in a moss-hole. I'll see that nobody talks." As I entered the porch, I heard the faint beat of an engine. Silhouetted against the dusky west was my friend, the monoplane. He gave me a room at the back of the house and access to his own study. I invented a job to get some time to myself. I sent him off the next morning on his motor bicycle to get the daily paper. I told him to keep his eyes open for strange cars or airplanes. Then I sat down in earnest to study Scudder's notebook. He returned at midday with the Scotsman. It contained nothing new, except a long article about Carolides and Balkan affairs. I managed to send the innkeeper away for the afternoon, for I was getting very warm in my search for the cipher. I knew it was a numerical cipher. By elaborate experiment, I had identified the spaces and punctuation. The trouble was the keyword. I felt hopeless thinking of the millions of possibilities. But about 3 o'clock, I had a sudden inspiration. The name Julia Czechenyi flashed across my memory. Scudder had said it was the key to the Carolides business. I decided to try it. It worked. The 5 letters of Julia gave the position of the vowels. Czechenyi gave the numerals for the consonants. I scribbled the scheme on a scrap of paper and began to decode Scudder's pages. Half an hour later, I was reading with a pale face, my fingers drumming on the table. I glanced out the window and saw a big touring car coming up the glen. It stopped at the door, and 2 men got out, both wearing long waterproof coats and tweed caps. 10 minutes later, the innkeeper slipped into the room, eyes bright with excitement. "There's 2 chaps below looking for you," he whispered. "They're in the dining room. They described you perfectly, down to your boots. I told them you stayed last night, but left on a motor bicycle this morning. One of them swore remarkably hard. I asked what they looked like. One was dark and thin. The other smiled constantly and lisped. Neither was a foreigner. I took a piece of paper and wrote a note in German, making it look like a fragment of a letter. Black stone. Scudder had got on to this, but he could not act for a fortnight. I doubt if I can do any good now, especially as Carolides is uncertain about his plans. But if Mr. T advises, I will do the best I. Take this down, I told the boy. Say it was found in my bedroom, and ask them to return it if they overtake me. 3 minutes later, I heard the car move. Peeping from behind the curtain, I saw the two figures. One was slim, the other sleek. That was all I could make out. The innkeeper returned, gleaming with joy. "Your paper woke them up," he said. The dark fellow went white as death, and the fat one looked ugly. They paid and left without waiting for change. "Now," I said, "get on your bicycle and go to the chief constable. Describe the two men and say you suspect them of the London murder. Invent reasons if you must. They will come back, not tonight, but first thing tomorrow. Tell the police to be here bright and early." He set off like a docile child. When he returned, we dined, and I gave him more stories about lion hunts and wars to keep him happy. When he went to bed, I sat up and finished decoding Scudder's notes. I smoked in my chair until daylight, unable to sleep. About 8 the next morning, 2 constables and a sergeant arrived. They hid their car and entered the house. 20 minutes later, I saw a second car cross the plateau. It didn't come up to the inn, but stopped 200 yards away, sheltered by a patch of woods. I noticed the occupants carefully reversed it before getting out. A moment later, I heard their steps on the gravel. I had planned to hide and watch, hoping the clash between the police and my pursuers would work to my advantage. But now I had a better idea. I scribbled a line of thanks to my host, opened the window, and dropped quietly into a gooseberry bush. Unobserved, I crossed the wall, crawled down a stream bed, and reached the trees. There stood the car, spick and span in the sunlight, but covered in dust from a long journey. I started the engine, jumped into the driver's seat, and stole gently out onto the plateau. Almost at once, the road dipped, hiding the inn from view, but the wind seemed to carry the sound of angry voices. Chapter 4: The Adventure of the Radical Candidate. Picture me driving that 40-horsepower car for all she was worth over the crisp moor roads on that shining May morning. I glanced back first over my shoulder, then looked anxiously to the next turn, driving with a vague eye, just awake enough to keep on the highway. I was thinking desperately of what I had found in Scudder's pocketbook. The little man had told me a pack of lies. All his yarns about the Balkans, the anarchists, and the Foreign Office Conference were eyewash. So was Carolides. And yet, not quite. I had staked everything on his story and been let down. Now, his book told a different tale, and instead of being suspicious, I believed it absolutely. Why? I don't know. It rang desperately true. The first yarn had been true in spirit, if not in fact. The 15th of June was to be a day of destiny, bigger than a simple political assassination. It was so big I didn't blame Scudder for keeping me out of the game. He wanted to play a lone hand. It was the risk, after all, that he was greedy for. The whole story was in the notes, with gaps he would have filled from memory. He listed his authorities, giving them numerical values to rate their reliability. A man named Ducrosson got 5 out of 5. The bare bones of the tale were there, along with one queer phrase that appeared half a dozen times. 39 steps. The last entry read, 39 steps, I counted them. High tide 10:17 p.m. I could make nothing of that. The first thing I learned was that this wasn't about preventing a war. War was coming, sure as Christmas. It had been arranged since February 1912. Carolides was merely the trigger. He was booked to die on June 14th, 2 weeks and 4 days from that May morning. Nothing on earth could prevent it. Scudder's talk of guards protecting him was all rubbish. The second thing was that this war would come as a mighty surprise to Britain. Carolide's death would throw the Balkans into chaos. Vienna would step in with an ultimatum. Russia would object. But Berlin would play the peacemaker, pouring oil on the waters, until suddenly she would find a cause for quarrel and strike at us. Honey and fair speeches, then a stroke in the dark. While we discussed Germany's good intentions, our coast would be silently ringed with mines, submarines waiting for every battleship. All this depended on a third event, set for June 15th. I wouldn't have grasped this if I hadn't once met a French staff officer who told me that, despite the nonsense talked in Parliament, there was a real alliance between France and Britain. In June, a high-ranking official was coming from Paris to receive the mobilization plans of the British Home Fleet. It was uncommonly important. But on the 15th of June, others would be in London. Scudder called them the Black Stone. They represented our deadly foes. The information destined for France was to be diverted to their pockets, to be used a week or two later with great guns and swift torpedoes in the darkness of a summer night. This was the story I had deciphered in a back room overlooking a cabbage garden. This was the story humming in my brain as I swung the big touring car from glen to glen. My first impulse was to write to the Prime Minister. But who would believe me? I needed proof. Above all, I had to keep moving, ready to act when the time was right. That would be no light job with the British police in full cry after me, and the watchers of the Black Stone running silently on my trail. I had no clear plan, but I steered east to avoid the industrial north. I drove down from the moorlands, traversing the broad valley of a river. I passed a great castle, thatched villages, and gardens blazing with hawthorn and yellow laburnum. The land was so deep in peace I could scarcely believe that men were hunting me, or that in a month's time, unless I had incredible luck, these peaceful fields would be filled with the dead. About midday, I entered a straggling village, intending to eat. Halfway down, I saw the postmistress and a policeman reading a telegram on the post office steps. When they saw me, the policeman shouted for me to stop. I nearly obeyed. Then I realized the wire was about me, my description sent to 30 villages. I released the brakes just in time. The policeman clawed at the hood and only dropped off when I caught him in the eye with my left fist. I realized the main roads were unsafe and turned into the byways. Without a map, I risked ending up in a farmyard, but I couldn't afford delay. I began to see what a fool I'd been to steal the car. That big green brute was a beacon across the breadth of Scotland. Yet if I abandoned it, I'd lose my lead. I sought the loneliest roads, striking up a tributary glen with steep hills and a corkscrew climb over a pass. It took me too far north, so I turned east along a bad track, finally striking a double-line railway. Below lay another broad valley. Evening was drawing in, and I was furiously hungry, having eaten nothing since breakfast but 2 buns. Just then I heard a noise in the sky. Lo and behold, there was that infernal aeroplane, flying low a dozen miles south and coming rapidly toward me. On the bare moor, I was at the plane's mercy. I needed the leafy cover of the valley. I went down the hill like blue lightning, looking back whenever I dared. Soon I was dipping into the deep-cut glen. Then, near a thick wood, I slackened speed. Suddenly, on my left, a car horn hooted. I realized with horror that I was almost upon a private road emerging onto the highway. I slammed on my brakes, but my momentum was too great. A car was sliding across my path. To avoid a wreck, I steered slap into the hedge on the right, hoping for a soft landing. I was mistaken. My car slithered through the hedge like butter, then plunged. I tried to jump, but a hawthorn branch caught my chest and held me suspended while tons of expensive metal slipped beneath me, dropping 50 feet to the stream bed with an almighty smash. Slowly, the thorn let me go. I fell onto the hedge, then into a bed of nettles. As I scrambled up, a hand took my arm. A sympathetic, scared voice asked if I was hurt. I found myself looking at a tall young man in goggles and a leather coat, apologizing profusely. Once I got my wind back, I was actually glad. This was one way to get rid of the car. "My fault, sir," I answered. "It's lucky I didn't add homicide to my follies. That's the end of my motor tour, but it might have been the end of my life." He checked his watch. "You're the right sort," he said. "I can spare 15 minutes. My house is nearby. I'll see you clothed and fed. Where's your kit?" "In the stream with the car." "In my pocket," I said, showing him a toothbrush. "I'm a colonial. I travel light." "A colonial!" he cried. "By gad, you're the man I've been praying for. Are you by any chance a free trader?" "I am," I said, without the foggiest notion of what he meant. He hurried me into his car. 3 minutes later, we arrived at a comfortable lodge among pine trees. He took me to a bedroom and offered me his suits, as mine were rags. I chose a loose blue serge. Then he led me to the dining room. "You have 5 minutes to eat," he announced. "Take a snack for the road. We'll have supper later. I must be at the Masonic Hall by 8, or my political agent will have my head." I had a cup of coffee and some cold ham while he yarned away on the hearthrug. "You find me in a terrible mess, Mr. Twisden," he said. "By the way, any relation to old Tommy Twisden of the 60th? No. Well, I'm the Liberal candidate for this part of the world, and I have a meeting tonight at Brattleburn. It's an infernal Tory stronghold. I had the colonial ex-premier, Crumpleton, coming to speak, and I had the whole place primed for him. But this afternoon I got a wire saying he has the flu at Blackpool. Now I'm left to do the whole thing myself. I meant to speak for 10 minutes. Now I have to go on for 40, and I simply cannot last the course." He looked at me with desperation. "You've got to be a good chap and help me. You're a free trader and can tell our people what a washout protection is in the colonies. You fellows have the gift of the gab. I wish to heaven I had it. I'll be forever in your debt." I had very few notions about free trade one way or the other, but I saw no other chance to get what I wanted. My young gentleman was far too absorbed in his own difficulties to think how odd it was to ask a stranger, who had just missed death by an inch and lost a 1,000-guinea car, to address a meeting on the spur of the moment. But my necessities did not allow me to be picky. "All right," I said. "I'm not much of a speaker, but I'll tell them a bit about Australia." The cares of the ages slipped from his shoulders, and he was rapturous in his thanks. He lent me a big driving coat, never asking why I had started a motor tour without one, and as we slipped down the dusty roads, he poured out his history. He was an orphan, raised by an uncle in the cabinet. He had travelled the world after Cambridge, and being short of a job, His uncle advised politics. He had no real preference in parties. "Good chaps in both," he said cheerfully, "and plenty of blighters too. I'm Liberal because my family have always been Whigs." But if he was lukewarm politically, he had strong views on other things. He found out I knew a bit about horses and talked endlessly about the Derby entries and his plans for improving his shooting. Altogether, he was a very clean, decent, callow young man. As we passed through a little town, 2 policemen signalled us to stop and flashed their lanterns on us. "Beg pardon, Sir Harry," said one. "We've got instructions to look out for a car, and the description isn't unlike yours." "Right-o," said my host, while I thanked Providence for the devious path that had brought me to safety. After that, he spoke no more. His mind began to struggle with his coming speech. His lips muttered, his eyes wandered, and I began to prepare myself for a second catastrophe. I tried to think of something to say to myself, but my mind was dry as a stone. The next thing I knew, we had drawn up outside a street door and were being welcomed by noisy gentlemen wearing rosettes. The hall held about 500 people, mostly women, a lot of bald heads, and a dozen young men. The chairman, a weaselly minister with a reddish nose, lamented Crumpleton's absence, talked about his influenza, and introduced me as a trusted leader of Australian thought. There were 2 policemen at the door, and I hoped they took note of that testimonial. Then Sir Harry started. I never heard anything like it. He didn't know how to talk. He had a bushel of notes to read, and when he let go of them, he fell into a prolonged stutter. Every now and then he remembered a phrase he'd learned by heart, straightened his back, and delivered it like an actor, only to bend double the next moment, crooning over his papers. It was an appalling rot, too. He talked about the German menace being a Tory invention to cheat the poor of their rights. He argued for reducing our navy to prove our good faith, claiming that without the Tories, Germany and Britain would be fellow workers in peace. I thought of the little black book in my pocket. Scudder's friends cared for peace and reform. Yet, in a queer way, I liked the speech. You could see the decency of the chap shining out behind the muck he had been spoon-fed. Also, it took a load off my mind. I might not be an orator, but I was 1,000% better than Sir Harry. I didn't do badly when it was my turn. I simply told them all I could remember about Australia, praying there were no Australians present, talking about Labour parties, emigration, and universal service. I doubt I mentioned free trade, but I said there were no Tories in Australia, only Labour and Liberals. That fetched a cheer. I woke them up a bit when I talked about the glorious business we could make of the Empire if we really put our backs into it. Altogether, I fancy I was a success. The minister didn't like me, though. When he proposed a vote of thanks, he called Sir Harry's speech statesmanlike, and mine having the eloquence of an emigration agent. When we were in the car again, my host was in wild spirits at having finished his job. "A ripping speech, Twisden," he said. "Now, you're coming home with me. I'm all alone, and if you stay a day or two, I'll show you some decent fishing." We had a hot supper, which I needed badly, and then drank whiskey in a cheery smoking room with a crackling wood fire. I thought the time had come to put my cards on the table. I saw by this man's eye that he was the kind you can trust. "Listen, Sir Harry," I said. "I've something important to say. You're a good fellow, and I'm going to be frank. Where on earth did you get that poisonous rubbish you talked about tonight?" His face fell. "Was it that bad?" he asked ruefully. "It did sound rather thin. I got most of it out of the Progressive magazine and pamphlets my agent sends me." But surely you don't think Germany would ever go to war with us? Ask that question in 6 weeks, and it won't need an answer, I said. If you'll give me your attention for half an hour, I'm going to tell you a story. I can still see that bright room with the old prints on the walls, Sir Harry standing restlessly on the hearth, and myself lying back in an armchair, speaking. I seemed to be another person, listening to my own voice, judging the reliability of my tale. It was the first time I had ever told anyone the exact truth, and it straightened the thing out in my own mind. I hid no detail. He heard all about Scudder, the Milkman, the notebook, and my doings in Galloway. Occasionally, he got very excited and walked up and down the rug. So you see, I concluded, you have in your house the man wanted for the Portland Place murder. Your duty is to send for the police and give me up. I don't think I'll get very far. There'll be an accident, and I'll have a knife in my ribs an hour after arrest. Nevertheless, it's your duty as a law-abiding citizen. He looked at me with bright, steady eyes. What was your job in Rhodesia, Mr. Hannay? Mining engineer, I said. I made my money cleanly and had a good time making it. Not a profession that weakens the nerves, is it? I laughed. As to that, my nerves are good enough. I took a hunting knife from the wall and did the old trick of tossing it and catching it in my lips. That requires a steady heart. He watched with a smile. I don't want proof. I may be an ass on the platform, but I can size up a man. You're no murderer and you're no fool, and I believe you. I'm going to back you up. Now, what can I do? First, I want you to write to your uncle. I've got to get in touch with the government before the 15th of June. He pulled his mustache. That won't help. This is Foreign Office business. My uncle wouldn't touch it. Besides, you'd never convince him. No, I'll do better. I'll write to the permanent secretary at the Foreign Office. He's my godfather, and one of the best. What do you want? He sat at a table and wrote to my dictation. The gist was that if a man called Twisden turned up before June 15th, he was to be treated kindly. Twisden would prove his identity by saying the words "Black Stone" and whistling Annie Laurie. "Good," said Sir Harry. "That's the proper style. By the way, you'll find my godfather, Sir Walter Bullivant, down at his country cottage on Whitsuntide. Now, what's next? You're about my height. Lend me the oldest tweed suit you've got. Anything will do, as long as the colour is the opposite of the clothes I destroyed this afternoon. Then show me a map and explain the lay of the land. Finally, if the police come, show them the car in the glen. If the other lot turn up, tell them I caught the South Express after your meeting." He promised to do all these things. I shaved off my moustache and got inside an ancient suit of heather mixture. The map gave me a notion of my whereabouts and told me the 2 things I needed: where to join the main railway to the south, and where to find the wildest districts nearby. At 2 o'clock he woke me from a nap in the armchair and led me into the dark, starry night. He handed me an old bicycle from the tool shed. "First turn to the right by the long fir wood," he instructed. "By daybreak you'll be well into the hills. Then pitch the bike into a bog and take to the moors on foot. You can put in a week among the shepherds and be as safe as if you were in New Guinea." I pedalled diligently up steep gravel roads until the skies grew pale with morning. As the mists cleared before the sun, I found myself in a wide green world with glens falling on every side and a faraway blue horizon. Here, at any rate, I could get early news of my enemies. Chapter 5: The Adventure of the Spectacled. Roadman. I sat on the very crest of the pass and took stock of my position. Behind me, the road climbed through a long cleft in the hills, the upper glen of some notable river. In front lay a flat space of maybe a mile, pitted with bog holes and rough with weeds. Beyond that, the road fell steeply into another glen, descending to a plain whose blue dimness melted into the distance. To the left and right were round-shouldered green hills, smooth as polished stones. But to the south, on my left hand, I caught a glimpse of high heathery mountains. I remembered them from the map, the great knot of hills I had chosen for my sanctuary. I was on the central rise of a huge upland country, and could see everything moving for miles. In the meadows below the road, half a mile back, a cottage smoked, but it was the only sign of human life. Otherwise, there was only the calling of birds and the tinkling of little streams. It was now about 7 o'clock. As I waited, I heard once again that ominous beat in the air. Then I realized that my vantage ground might, in reality, be a trap. There was no cover for a small bird in those bald green places. I sat quite still and hopeless while the beat grew louder. Then I saw an airplane coming up from the east. It was flying high, but as I looked, it dropped several hundred feet. It began to circle the knot of the hill in narrowing rings, just as a hawk wheels before it pounced. Now it was flying very low, and the observer on board caught sight of me. I could see one of the two occupants examining me through glasses. Suddenly, it began to rise in swift spirals. The next thing I knew, it was speeding eastward again until it became a speck in the blue morning. That made me do some savage thinking. My enemies had located me, and the next step would be a cordon around the area. I didn't know what force they could command, but I was certain it would be sufficient. The airplane had seen my bicycle and would conclude that I would try to escape by the road. In that case, there might be a chance on the moors to the right or left. I wheeled the machine 100 yards from the highway and plunged it into a bog hole, where it sank among pond weeds. Then I climbed to a knoll that gave me a view of the two valleys. Nothing was stirring on the long white ribbon of road that threaded them. I have said there was no cover in the whole place to hide a rat. As the day advanced, the land was flooded with soft, fresh light until it had the fragrant sootiness of the South African veldt. At other times I would have liked the place, but now it seemed to suffocate me. The free moorlands were prison walls, and the keen hill air was the breath of a dungeon. I tossed a coin, heads right, tails left. It fell heads, so I turned to the north. In a little while I came to the brow of the ridge that formed the wall of the pass. I saw the high road for maybe 10 miles. Far down it, something was moving, which I took to be a motor car. Beyond the ridge, I looked out on a rolling green moor that fell away into wooded glens. Now, my life on the veldt has given me the eyes of a kite. I can see things for which most men need a telescope. Away down the slope, a couple of miles off, several men were advancing like a row of beaters at a shoot. I dropped out of sight behind the skyline. That way was shut to me. I had to try the bigger hills to the south, beyond the highway. The car I had noticed was getting nearer, but it was still a long way off, facing some very steep gradients. I ran hard, crouching low except in the hollows. As I ran, I kept scanning the brow of the hill before me. Was it imagination, or did I see figures, 1, 2, perhaps more, moving in a glen beyond the stream? If you are hemmed in on all sides in a patch of land, there is only one chance of escape. You must stay in the patch, let your enemies search it, and not find you. That was good sense. But how on earth was I to escape notice in that flat expanse? I would have buried myself to the neck in mud, or lain below water, or climbed the tallest tree. But there was not a stick of wood. The bog-holes were little puddles, and the stream was a slender trickle. There was nothing but short heather, stiff grass, and the white highway. Then, in a tiny bend of the road beside a heap of stones, I found the roadman. He had just arrived, and was wearily flinging down his hammer. He looked at me with a glossy eye and yawned. "Confound the day I ever left the herding," he said, as if to the world at large. "There, I was my own master. Now I'm a slave to the government, tethered to the roadside with sore eyes and a back like a sickle." He took up the hammer, struck a stone, dropped the implement with an oath, and put both hands to his ears. "Mercy on me! My head is bursting." He was a wild figure, about my own size but much bent, with a weak beard on his chin and a pair of big horn-rimmed spectacles. "I cannot do it," he cried again. "The surveyor must just report me. I'm in bed." I asked him what the trouble was, though indeed it was clear enough. "The trouble is that I'm not sober. Last night my daughter was wedded, and they danced until 4 in the barn. Me and some other fellows sat down to drink, and here I am. Pity that I ever looked at the wine when it was red." I agreed with him about bed. "It's easy speaking," he moaned. "But I got a postcard yesterday saying that the new road surveyor would be around today. He'll come, and he'll not find me, or else he'll find me drunk. Either way, I'm a done man." Then I had an inspiration. "Does the new surveyor know you?" I asked. "Not him. He's just been at the job. He runs about in a little motor car and would ask the inside out of a shellfish. 'Where's your house?' I asked, and was directed by a wavering finger to the cottage by the stream. 'Well, go back to your bed,' I said, 'and sleep in peace. I'll take on your job for a bit and see the surveyor.' He stared at me blankly. Then, as the notion dawned on his fuddled brain, his face broke into a vacant smile. 'You're the lad,' he cried. 'It will be easily managed. I've finished that pile of stones, so you need not break any more this morning. Just take the barrow, and we'll enough gravel from that quarry down the road to make another pile tomorrow. My name's Alexander Turnbull. Friends call me Ecky, or sometimes Specky on account of the glasses. Just you speak to the surveyor fairly, call him sir, and he'll be well pleased. I'll be back by midday.' I borrowed his spectacles and filthy old hat. I stripped off my coat, waistcoat, and collar, and gave them to him to carry home. I borrowed, too, the foul stump of a clay pipe as a prop. He indicated my simple tasks, and, without more ado, set off at an amble bedwards. I prayed that he might be safe under cover before my friends arrived on the scene. Then I set to work to dress for the part. I opened the collar of my shirt. It was a vulgar blue and white check such as ploughman wear, and revealed a neck as brown as any tinker's. I rolled up my sleeves to show a forearm which might have been a blacksmith's, sunburnt and rough with old scars. I got my boots and trouser legs all white from the dust of the road, and hitched up my trousers, tying them with string below the knee. Then I went to work on my face. With a handful of dust, I made a watermark round my neck, the place where Mr. Turnbull's Sunday washing might be expected to stop. I rubbed a good deal of dirt into the sunburn of my cheeks. A roadman's eyes would no doubt be a little inflamed, so I contrived to get some dust in both of mine, and by dint of vigorous rubbing, produced a bleary effect. My boots did not satisfy me, but by kicking among the stones, I reduced them to the granite-like surface of a roadman's gear. Then I bit and scraped my fingernails until the edges were all cracked and uneven. The men I was matched against would miss no detail. My toilet complete, I took up the barrow and began my journeys to and from the quarry. I remember an old scout in Rhodesia, who had done many queer things in his day, once telling me that the secret of playing a part was to think yourself into it. You could never keep it up, he said, unless you could manage to convince yourself that you were the character. So I shut off all other thoughts and switched them on to road mending. I thought of the little white cottage as my home. I recalled the years I had spent herding on Lathen water. I made my mind dwell lovingly on sleep in a box bed and a bottle of cheap whiskey. Still, nothing appeared on that long white road. Now and then a sheep wandered off the heather to stare at me. A heron flopped down to a pool in the stream and started to fish, taking no more notice of me than if I had been a milestone. On I went, trundling my loads of stone with the heavy step of the professional. Soon I grew warm, and the dust on my face changed into solid, abiding grit. Suddenly a crisp voice spoke from the road. Looking up, I saw a little Ford two-seater and a round-faced young man in a bowler hat. "Are you Alexander Turnbull?" he asked. "I am the new county road surveyor. You live at Black Hope Foot? Good. A fair bit of road, Turnbull, and not badly engineered. A little soft about a mile back, and the edges want cleaning. See you look after that. Good morning." Clearly, my disguise was good enough for the dreaded surveyor. I went on with my work, and as the morning grew towards noon, I was cheered by a little traffic. A baker's van breasted the hill and sold me a bag of ginger biscuits, which I stowed in my pocket against emergencies. Then a herd passed with sheep and disturbed me somewhat by asking loudly what had become of Specky. "In bed with the colic," I replied, and the herd passed on. Just about midday, a big car stole down the hill, glided past, and drew up 100 yards beyond. Its 3 occupants descended as if to stretch their legs and sauntered towards me. 2 of the men I had seen before, one lean, sharp, and dark, the other comfortable and smiling. The third had the look of a countryman, a vet, perhaps, or a small farmer. "Morning," said the last man. "That's a fine, easy job of yours." I had not looked up on their approach. Now, when accosted, I slowly and painfully straightened my back, after the manner of roadmen, spat vigorously, and regarded them steadily before replying. I confronted 3 pairs of eyes that missed nothing. "There's worse jobs and there's better," I said. "I would rather have yours, sitting all day on your backsides on those cushions. It's you and your great cars that wreck my roads. If we all had our rights, you should be made to mend what you break." One of the others had been looking at my boots, and a word in German called the speaker's attention to them. "You've a fine taste in boots," he said. "These were never made by a country shoemaker." "They were not," I said readily. "They were made in London. I got them from the gentleman that was here last year for the shooting." Again the sleek one spoke in German. "Let us get on," he said. "This fellow is all right." They asked one last question. "Did you see anyone pass early this morning? He might be on a bicycle, or he might be on foot." I very nearly fell into the trap, and told a story of a bicyclist hurrying past in the grey dawn. But I had the sense to see my danger. I pretended to think deeply. "I wasn't up very early," I said. "You see, my daughter was married last night, and we kept it up late. Since I came up here there has just been the baker and the herdsman, besides you gentlemen. One of them gave me a cigar, which I smelt gingerly and stuck in my bundle. They got into their car and were out of sight in 3 minutes. My heart leaped with enormous relief, but I went on wheeling my stones. It was just as well, for 10 minutes later the car returned, one of the occupants waving a hand to me. Those gentry left nothing to chance. I stayed at my post until 5 o'clock. By that time I had resolved to go down to the cottage at nightfall and take my chance of getting over the hills in the darkness. But suddenly a new car came up the road and slowed down a yard or two from me. It was a touring car, loaded with baggage. One man sat in it, and by an amazing chance I knew him. His name was Marmaduke Jopley, and he was an offence to creation. He was a sort of high-society broker who did his business by toadying to rich young peers and foolish old ladies. Marmee was an adroit scandalmonger who would crawl a mile on his belly for anything with a title or a million. Anyhow, there he was now, nattily dressed, obviously on his way to visit some of his smart friends. A sudden madness took me. In a second I jumped into the car and had him by the shoulder. "Hullo, Jopley," I sang out. "Well met, my lad." He got a horrid fright. His chin dropped as he stared at me. "Who the devil are you?" he gasped. "My name's Hannay," I said. "From Rhodesia, you remember." "Good God, the murderer!" he choked. "Just so. And there'll be a second murder, my dear, if you don't do as I tell you. Give me that coat of yours. That cap, too." He did as he was bid, for he was blind with terror. Over my dirty trousers and vulgar shirt I put on his smart driving coat, which buttoned high and hid my collar. I stuck the cap on my head and added his gloves to my get-up. The dusty roadman was transformed into one of the neatest motorists in Scotland. On Mr. Jopley's head I clapped the roadman's unspeakable hat and told him to keep it there. Then, with some difficulty, I turned the car. My plan was to go back the way he had come, for the watchers, having seen the car before, would probably let it pass unremarked. "Now, my child," I said, "sit quite still and be a good boy. I mean you no harm. I'm only borrowing your car for an hour or two. But if you play me any tricks, and above all if you open your mouth, as sure as there's a God above me, I'll wring your neck. Understand?" I enjoyed that evening's ride. We ran 8 miles down the valley, through a village or two. I noticed several strange-looking folk lounging by the roadside, the watchers who would have had much to say to me if I had come in other garb. As it was, they looked on incuriously. One touched his cap in salute, and I responded graciously. As the dark fell, I turned up a side glen which led into an unfrequented corner of the hills. Presently we came to a lonely moor where the night was blackening the sunset gleam in the bog pools. Here we stopped, and I obligingly reversed the car and restored Mr. Jopley's belongings. "1,000 thanks," I said. "There's more use in you than I thought. Now be off and find the police." As I sat on the hillside, watching the tail-light dwindle, I reflected on the various kinds of crime I had now sampled. Contrary to general belief, I was not a murderer, but I had become an unholy liar, a shameless impostor, and a highwayman with a marked taste for expensive motor cars. Chapter 6: The Adventure of the Bald Archaeologist. I spent the night on a shelf of the hillside, in the lee of a boulder where the heather grew long and soft. It was a cold business, for I had neither a coat nor waistcoat. These were in Mr. Turnbull's keeping, along with Scudder's little book, my watch, and, worst of all, my pipe and tobacco. Only my money accompanied me in my belt, and about ½ a pound of ginger biscuits in my trousers pocket. I supped off half those biscuits, and by worming myself deep into the heather, I managed to get some kind of warmth. My spirits had risen, and I was beginning to enjoy this crazy game of hide-and-seek. So far, I have been miraculously lucky. The Milkman, the literary innkeeper, Sir Harry, the Roadman, and the idiotic Marmee, They were all pieces of undeserved good fortune. The initial success gave me a feeling that I was going to pull the thing through. My chief trouble was that I was desperately hungry. If a financier shoots himself in the city, the newspapers usually report that the deceased was well-nourished. I remember thinking that they would not call me well-nourished if I broke my neck in a bog-hole. I lay and tortured myself, for the ginger biscuits merely emphasized the aching void, with a memory of all the good food I had thought so little of in London. I thought of Paddock's crisp sausages and fragrant shavings of bacon. I thought of shapely poached eggs. How often I had turned up my nose at them. There were the cutlets they did at the club, and a particular ham that stood on the cold table, for which my soul lusted. My thoughts hovered over all varieties of edible things, finally settling on a porterhouse steak and a quart of bitter. Longing hopelessly for these dainties, I fell asleep. I woke up very cold and stiff about an hour after dawn. It took me a moment to remember where I was, for I had been weary and slept heavily. I saw first the pale blue sky through a net of heather, then a big shoulder of a hill, and then my own boots placed neatly in a berry bush. I raised myself on my arms and looked down into the valley. That one look set me lacing up my boots in mad haste. There were men below, not more than a quarter of a mile off, spaced out on the hillside like a fan, beating the heather. Marmee had not been slow in looking for his revenge. I crawled out of my shelf into the cover of a boulder, and gained a shallow trench which slanted up the mountain face. This led me presently into the narrow gully of a stream, by way of which I scrambled to the top of the ridge. From there I looked back and saw that I was still undiscovered. My pursuers were patiently quartering the hillside and moving upwards. Keeping behind the skyline, I ran for maybe half a mile until I judged I was above the uppermost end of the glen. Then I showed myself. I was instantly spotted by one of the flankers, who passed the word to the others. I heard cries coming up from below, and saw that the line of search had changed its direction. I pretended to retreat over the skyline, but instead I doubled back the way I had come. In 20 minutes I was behind a ridge overlooking my sleeping place. From that viewpoint I had the satisfaction of seeing the pursuit streaming up the hill at the top of the glen on a hopelessly false scent. I had a choice of routes, and I chose a ridge that angled away from the one I was on, putting a deep glen between me and my enemies. The exercise had warmed my blood, and I was beginning to enjoy myself amazingly. As I went, I breakfasted on the dusty remnants of the ginger biscuits. I knew very little about the country, and I hadn't a notion of what I was going to do. I trusted the strength of my legs, but I was well aware that those behind me would be familiar with the lie of the land. My ignorance would be a heavy handicap. I saw in front of me a sea of hills, rising very high towards the south, but northwards breaking down into broad ridges. The ridge I had chosen seemed to sink after a mile or two to a moor which lay like a pocket in the uplands. That seemed as good a direction to take as any. My stratagem had given me a fair start, call it 20 minutes, and I had the width of a glen behind me before I saw the first heads of the pursuers. The police had evidently called in local talent to their aid. The men I could see had the appearance of herdsmen or gamekeepers. They hallooed at the sight of me, and I waved my hand. Two dived into the glen and began to climb my ridge, while the others kept their own side of the hill. I felt as if I were taking part in a schoolboy game of hare and hounds. But very soon it began to seem less of a game. Those fellows behind were hefty men on their native heath. Looking back, I saw that only 3 were following directly, and I guessed that the others had circled around to cut me off. I resolved to get out of this tangle of glens to the pocket of moor I had seen from the tops. I must increase my distance to get clear away, and I believed I could do this if I found the right ground. If there had been cover, I would have tried stalking, but on these bare slopes you could see a fly a mile off. My hope lay in the length of my legs and the soundness of my wind. How I longed for a good African pony! I put on a great spurt, getting off the ridge and down into the moor before any figures appeared on the skyline behind me. I crossed a stream and came out on a highroad which made a pass between two glens. All in front of me was a big field of heather sloping up to a crest crowned with an odd feather of trees. In the stone wall by the roadside was a gate, from which a grass-grown track led over the first wave of the moor. I jumped the wall and followed the track. After a few hundred yards, as soon as it was out of sight of the highway, the grass stopped and it became a respectable road, evidently kept with some care. Clearly it ran to a house, and I began to think of doing the same. Hitherto my luck had held, and it might be that my best chance would be found in this remote dwelling. At the very least, there were trees there, and that meant cover. I did not follow the road, but rather the bank of the stream that flanked it on the right, where the bracken grew deep and the high banks made a tolerable screen. I did so. No sooner had I gained the hollow than I looked back and saw the pursuit topping the ridge from which I had descended. After that I did not look back. I had no time. I ran up the stream side, crawling over the open places, and for a large part wading in the shallow water. I found a deserted cottage with a row of phantom peat stacks and an overgrown garden. Then I was among young hay, and very soon had come to the edge of a plantation of wind-blown firs. From there I saw the chimneys of the house smoking a few hundred yards to my left. I forsook the stream, crossed another wall, and almost before I knew it, was on a rough lawn. A glance back told me that I was well out of sight of the pursuit, which had not yet passed the first rise of the moor. The lawn was a rough place, cut with a scythe instead of a mower, and planted with beds of scrubby rhododendrons. A brace of black grouse, not usually garden birds, rose at my approach. The house before me was an ordinary moorland farm, with a more pretentious whitewashed wing added. Attached to this wing was a glass veranda, and through the glass I saw the face of an elderly gentleman meekly watching me. I walked over the border of coarse hill gravel and entered the open veranda door. Within was a pleasant room, glass on one side, and on the other a mass of books. More books showed in an inner room. On the floor, instead of tables, stood display cases such as you see in a museum, filled with coins and queer stone implements. There was a desk in the middle, and seated at it, with papers and open volumes before him, was the benevolent old gentleman. His face was round and shiny, like Mr. Pickwick's. Big glasses were stuck on the end of his nose, and the top of his head was as bright and bare as a glass bottle. He never moved when I entered, but raised his placid eyebrows and waited for me to speak. It was not an easy job, with about 5 minutes to spare, to tell a stranger who I was and what I wanted. I did not attempt it. There was something about the eye of the man before me, something so keen and knowledgeable, that I could not find a word. I simply stared at him and stuttered. "You seem in a hurry, my friend," he said slowly. I nodded towards the window. It gave a view across the moor through a gap in the plantation, revealing certain figures half a mile off straggling through the heather. "Ah, I see," he said, and took up a pair of field glasses through which he patiently scrutinized the figures. "A fugitive from justice, eh? Well, we'll go into the matter at our leisure. Meantime, I object to my privacy being broken upon by the clumsy rural policeman. Go into my study, and you will see 2 doors facing you. Take the one on the left and close it behind you. You will be perfectly safe." And this extraordinary man took up his pen again. I did as I was told, and found myself in a little dark chamber which smelt of chemicals, lit only by a tiny window high up in the wall. The door had swung behind me with a click like the door of a safe. Once again, I had found an unexpected sanctuary. All the same, I was not comfortable. There was something about the old gentleman which puzzled and rather terrified me. He had been too easy and ready, almost as if he had expected me, and his eyes had been horribly intelligent. No sound came to me in that dark place. For all I knew, the police might be searching the house, and if they did, they would want to know what was behind this door. I tried to possess my soul in patience, and to forget how hungry I was. Then I took a more cheerful view. The old gentleman could scarcely refuse me a meal. I fell to reconstructing my breakfast. Bacon and eggs would content me, but I wanted the better part of a side of bacon and 100 eggs. While my mouth was watering in anticipation, there was a click, and the door stood open. I emerged into the sunlight to find the master of the house sitting in a deep armchair in the room he called his study, regarding me with curious eyes. "Have they gone?" I asked. "They have gone. I convinced them that you had crossed the hill. I do not choose that the police should come between me and one whom I am delighted to honour. This is a lucky morning for you, Mr. Richard Hannay." As he spoke, his eyelids seemed to tremble and fall a little over his keen grey eyes. In a flash, Scudder's phrase came back to me, when he had described the man he most dreaded in the world. He had said that he could hood his eyes like a hawk. Then I saw that I had walked straight into the enemy's headquarters. My first impulse was to throttle the old villain and make for the open air. He seemed to anticipate my intention, for he smiled gently and nodded to the door behind me. I turned and saw 2 men-servants who had me covered with pistols. He knew my name, but he had never seen me before. As that reflection darted across my mind, I saw a slender chance. "I don't know what you mean," I said roughly. "And who are you calling Richard Hannay?" "My name's Ainsley." "So," he said, still smiling. "But of course you have others. We won't quarrel about a name." I was pulling myself together now. I reflected that my garb, lacking a coat and waistcoat, would not betray me. I put on my surliest face and shrugged my shoulders. "I suppose you're going to give me up after all. I call it a damned dirty trick. My God, I wish I had never seen that cursed motor car. Here's the money, and be damned to you." I flung 4 sovereigns on the table. He opened his eyes a little. "Oh no, I shall not give you up. My friends and I will have a little private settlement with you, that is all. You know a little too much, Mr. Hannay. You are a clever actor, but not quite clever enough." He spoke with assurance, but I could see the dawning of a doubt in his mind. "Oh, for God's sake stop jawing," I cried. "Everything's against me. I haven't had a bit of luck since I came on shore at Leith. What's the harm in a poor devil with an empty stomach picking up some money he finds in a wrecked motor car? That's all I've done, and for that I've been chased for 2 days by those blasted police over these blasted hills. I tell you I'm fairly sick of it. You can do what you like, old boy. Ned Ainsley's got no fight left in him." I could see that the doubt was gaining. "Will you oblige me with the story of your recent doings?" he asked. "I can't, Governor," I said in a real beggar's whine. "I've not had a bite to eat for 2 days. Give me a mouthful of food, and then you'll hear God's truth." I must have shown my hunger in my face, for he signalled to one of the men in the doorway. A bit of cold pie was brought and a glass of beer, and I wolfed them down, or rather like Ned Ainsley, for I was keeping up my character. In the middle of my meal, he spoke suddenly to me in German, but I turned on him with a face as blank as a stone wall. Then I told him my story, how I had come off an Archangel ship at Leith a week ago, and was making my way overland to my brother at Wigton. I had run short of cash. I hinted vaguely at a spree, and was pretty well on my uppers. I had come upon a hole in a hedge, and looking through, saw a big motor car lying in the stream. I poked about to see what had happened, and found 3 sovereigns lying on the seat and 1 on the floor. There was nobody there, so I pocketed the cash. But somehow the law got after me. When I tried to change a sovereign in a baker's shop, the woman called the police. Later, when I was washing my face in a stream, I was nearly gripped and only got away by leaving my coat and waistcoat behind. "They can have the money back," I cried, "for a fat lot of good it's done me. Those parishers are all down on a poor man. Now, if it had been you, Governor, that had found the quids, nobody would have troubled you." "You're a good liar, Hannay," he said. I flew into a rage. "Stop fooling, damn you. I tell you my name's Ainsley, and I never heard of anyone called Hannay in my born days. I'd sooner have the police than you with your Hannays and your pistol tricks. No, Governor, I beg pardon, I don't mean that. I'm much obliged to you for the grub, and I'll thank you for letting me go now the coast is clear." It was obvious that he was badly puzzled. You see, he had never seen me, and my appearance must have altered considerably from my photographs. I was pretty smart and well dressed in London. Now I was a regular tramp. "I do not propose to let you go. If you are what you say you are, you will soon have a chance of clearing yourself. If you are what I believe you are, I do not think you will see the light much longer." He rang a bell, and a third servant appeared from the veranda. "I want the Lanchester in 5 minutes," he said. "There will be 3 to luncheon." Then he looked steadily at me, and that was the hardest ordeal of all. There was something weird and devilish in those eyes, cold, malignant, unearthly, and most hellishly clever. They fascinated me like the bright eyes of a snake. I had a strong impulse to throw myself on his mercy and offer to join his side. If you consider how I felt about the whole thing, you will see that impulse was purely physical, the weakness of a brain mesmerized and mastered by a stronger spirit. But I managed to stick it out and even to grin. "You'll know me next time, Governor," I said. "Karl," he spoke in German to one of the men in the doorway, "put this fellow in the storeroom until I return. You will be answerable to me for his keeping." I was marched out of the room with a pistol in each ear. The storeroom was a damp chamber in what had been the old farmhouse. There was no carpet on the uneven floor, and nothing to sit on but a wooden bench. It was black as pitch, for the windows were heavily shuttered. I made out by groping that the walls were lined with boxes, barrels, and sacks of some heavy stuff. The whole place smelt of mould and disuse. My jailers turned the key in the door, and I could hear them shifting their feet as they stood on guard outside. I sat down in that chilly darkness in a very miserable frame of mind. The old boy had gone off in a motor to collect the 2 ruffians who had interviewed me yesterday. Now they had seen me as the Roadman, and they would remember me, for I was in the same disguise. What was a roadman doing 20 miles from his beat, pursued by the police? A question or two would put them on the track. Probably they had seen Mr. Turnbull, and probably Marmee too. Most likely they could link me up with Sir Harry, and then the whole thing would be clear. What chance had I had in this moorland house with 3 desperadoes and their armed servants? I began to think wistfully of the police, now plodding over the hills after my phantom. They, at any rate, were fellow countrymen and honest men. Their tender mercies would be kinder than these ghoulish strangers. But they wouldn't have listened to me. That old devil with the eyelids had not taken long to get rid of them. I thought he probably had some kind of influence with the constabulary. Most likely he had letters from ministers saying he was to be given every facility for plotting against Britain. That's the sort of foolish way we run our politics in this jolly old country. The three would be back for lunch, so I hadn't more than a couple of hours to wait. It was simply waiting on destruction, for I could see no way out of this mess. I wished that I had Scudder's courage, for I admit I didn't feel any great fortitude. The only thing that kept me going was that I was pretty furious. It made me boil with rage to think of those three spies getting the upper hand like this. I hoped that at any rate I might be able to twist one of their necks before they downed me. The more I thought of it, the angrier I grew. I had to get up and move about the room. I tried the shutters, but they were the kind that lock with a key, and I couldn't move them. From the outside came the faint clucking of hens in the warm sun. Then I groped among the sacks and boxes. I couldn't open the latter, and the sacks seemed to be full of things like dog biscuits that smelt of cinnamon. But as I circled the room, I found a handle in the wall which seemed worth investigating. It was the door of a wall cupboard, what they call a press in Scotland, and it was locked. I shook it, and it seemed rather flimsy. For want of something better to do, I put my strength on that door, getting some purchase on the handle by looping my braces round it. Presently the thing gave with a crash, which I thought would bring in my warders to inquire. I waited for a bit, and then started to explore the cupboard shelves. There were a multitude of queer things there. I found an odd match or two in my trouser pockets and struck a light. It was out in a second, but it showed me one thing, a little stock of electric torches on one shelf. I picked up one and found it was in working order. With the torch to help me, I investigated further. There were bottles and cases of queer-smelling stuffs, chemicals, no doubt, for experiments. There were coils of fine copper wire and yards of thin oiled silk. There was a box of detonators, and a lot of cord for fuses. Then, away at the back of the shelf, I found a stout brown cardboard box, and inside it a wooden case. I managed to wrench it open. Within lay half a dozen little grey bricks, each a couple of inches square. I took up one and found that it crumbled easily in my hand. Then I smelt it and put my tongue to it. After that, I sat down to think. I hadn't been a mining engineer for nothing, and I knew lentonite when I saw it. With one of these bricks, I could blow the house to smithereens. I had used the stuff in Rhodesia and knew its power. But the trouble was that my knowledge wasn't exact. I had forgotten the proper charge and the right way of preparing it. I wasn't sure about the timing. I had only a vague notion as to its power, for though I had used it, I had not handled it with my own fingers. But it was a chance, the only possible chance. It was a mighty risk, but against it was an absolute black certainty. If I used it, the odds were about 5 to 1 in favour of my blowing myself into the treetops. But if I didn't, I should very likely be occupying a 6-foot hole in the garden by the evening. That was the way I had to look at it. The prospect was pretty dark either way, but anyhow there was a chance, both for myself and for my country. The remembrance of little Scudder decided me. It was about the worst moment of my life, for I'm no good at these cold-blooded resolutions. Still, I managed to rake up the pluck to set my teeth and choke back the horrid doubts that flooded in on me. I simply shut off my mind and pretended I was doing an experiment as simple as fireworks. I got a detonator and fixed it to a couple of feet of fuse. Then I took a quarter of a lentonite brick and buried it near the door below one of the sacks in a crack of the floor. For all I knew, half those boxes might be dynamite. If the cupboard held such deadly explosives, why not the boxes? In that case, there would be a glorious skyward journey for me, the German servants, and about an acre of surrounding country. There was also the risk that the detonation might set off the other bricks in the cupboard. But it didn't help me to begin thinking about the possibilities. The odds were horrible, but I had to take them. I positioned myself just below the sill of the window and lit the fuse. Then I waited. There was dead silence, only a shuffle of heavy boots in the passage, and the peaceful cluck of hens from the warm out-of-doors. I commended my soul to my Maker, and wondered where I would be in 5 seconds. A great wave of heat seemed to surge upwards from the floor and hang for a blistering instant in the air. Then the wall opposite me flashed into a golden yellow and dissolved with a rending thunder that hammered my brain into a pulp. Something dropped on me, catching the point of my left shoulder. Then I think I became unconscious. My stupor can scarcely have lasted beyond a few seconds. I felt myself being choked by thick yellow fumes and struggled out of the debris to my feet. Somewhere behind me I felt fresh air. The frame of the window had fallen, and through the ragged rent, smoke was pouring out to the summer noon. I stepped over the broken lintel and found myself standing in a yard in a dense, acrid fog. I felt very sick and ill, but I could move my limbs. I staggered blindly forward, away from the house. A small mill stream ran in a wooden aqueduct at the other side of the yard, and into this I fell. The cool water revived me, and I had just enough wits left to think of escape. I squirmed up the channel among the slippery green slime until I reached the mill wheel. Then I wriggled through the axle hole into the old mill and tumbled onto a bed of chaff. A nail caught the seat of my trousers, and I left a wisp of cloth behind me. The mill had been long out of use. The ladders were rotten with age, and in the loft the rats had gnawed great holes in the floor. Nausea shook me, and a wheel in my head kept turning, while my left shoulder and arm seemed to be numb. I looked out of the window and saw a fog still hanging over the house and smoke escaping from an upper window. Please God I had set the place on fire, for I could hear confused cries coming from the other side. But I had no time to linger, since this mill was obviously a bad hiding-place. Anyone looking for me would naturally follow the stream, and I made certain the search would begin as soon as they found that my body was not in the storeroom. From another window, I saw that on the far side of the mill stood an old stone dovecot. If I could get there without leaving tracks, I might find a hiding-place. I argued that my enemies, if they thought I could move, would conclude I had made for open country and would go seeking me on the moor. I crawled down the broken ladder, scattering chaff behind me to cover my footsteps. I did the same on the mill floor and on the threshold where the door hung on broken hinges. Peeping out, I saw that between me and the dovecot was a piece of bare cobbled ground where no footmarks would show. Also, it was mercifully hidden by the mill buildings from any view from the house. I slipped across the space, got to the back of the dovecot, and looked for a way up. That was one of the hardest jobs I ever took on. My shoulder and arm ached like hell, and I was so sick and giddy that I was always on the verge of falling. But I managed it somehow. By the use of jutting stones, gaps in the masonry, and a tough ivy root, I got to the top in the end. There was a little parapet behind which I found space to lie down. Then I proceeded to faint. I woke with a burning head and the sun glaring in my face. For a long time I lay motionless, for those horrible fumes seemed to have loosened my joints and dulled my brain. Sounds came to me from the house, men speaking hoarsely and the throbbing of a stationary car. There was a little gap in the parapet to which I wriggled, and from which I had a view of the yard. I saw figures come out, a servant with his head bound up, and then a younger man in breeches. They were looking for something, and moved towards the mill. Then one of them caught sight of the wisp of cloth on the nail, and cried out to the other. They both went back to the house, and brought 2 more to look at it. I saw the round figure of my late captor, and I thought I made out the man with the lisp. All of them had pistols. For half an hour they ransacked the mill. I could hear them kicking over the barrels and pulling up the rotten planking. Then they came outside and stood just below the dovecot, arguing fiercely. The servant with the bandage was being soundly yelled at. I heard them fiddling with the door of the dovecot, and for one horrid moment I fancied they were coming up. Then they thought better of it and went back to the house. All that long blistering afternoon I lay baking on the rooftop. Thirst was my chief torment. My tongue was like a stick, and to make it worse, I could hear the cool drip of water from the mill stream. I watched the course of the little stream as it came in from the moor, and my fancy followed it to the top of the glen, where it must emerge from an icy fountain fringed with cool ferns and mosses. I would have given £1,000 to plunge my face into that. I had a fine view of the whole ring of moorland. I saw the car speed away with 2 occupants, and a man on a hill pony riding east. I judged they were looking for me, and I wished them joy of their quest. But I saw something else more interesting. The house stood almost on the summit of a swell of moorland which crowned a sort of plateau. The actual summit was a large clump of trees, first mostly, with a few ashes and beeches. On the dovecot I was almost on a level with the treetops, and could see what lay beyond. The wood was not solid, but only a ring, and inside was an oval of green turf, for all the world like a big cricket field. I didn't take long to guess what it was. It was an airfield, and a secret one. The place had been most cunningly chosen. Suppose anyone were watching an aeroplane descending here. He would think it had gone over the hill beyond the trees. As the place was on the top of a rise in the midst of a big amphitheatre, any observer from any direction would conclude it had passed out of view behind the hill. Only a man very close at hand would realize that the airplane had not gone over, but had descended in the midst of the woods. An observer with a telescope on one of the higher hills might have discovered the truth, but only shepherds went there, and shepherds do not carry spyglasses. When I looked from the dovecot, I could see far away a blue line which I knew was the sea. I grew furious to think that our enemies had this secret tower to spy on our shipping. Then I reflected that if that airplane came back, the chances were 10 to 1 that I would be discovered. So, through the afternoon, I lay and prayed for the coming of darkness. Glad I was when the sun went down over the big western hills and the twilight haze crept over the moor. The airplane was late. The twilight was far advanced when I heard the beat of wings and saw it gliding downward to its home in the woods. Lights twinkled for a bit, and there was much coming and going from the house. Then dark fell, and silence. Thank God it was a black night. The moon was well in its last quarter, and would not rise till late. My thirst was too great to allow me to wait, so at about 9 o'clock, so far as I could judge, I started to descend. It wasn't easy. Halfway down I heard the back door of the house open, and saw the gleam of a lantern against the mill wall. For some agonizing minutes I hung by the ivy and prayed that whoever it was would not come round by the dovecot. Then the light disappeared, and I dropped as softly as I could onto the hard soil of the yard. I crawled on my belly in the lee of a stone wall until I reached the fringe of trees which surrounded the house. If I had known how to do it, I would have tried to put that aeroplane out of action, but I realized that any attempt would probably be futile. I was pretty certain that there would be some kind of defense round the house, so I went through the wood on hands and knees, feeling carefully every inch before me. It was just as well, for presently I came on a wire about 2 feet from the ground. If I had tripped over that, it would doubtless have rung some bell in the house, and I would have been captured. 100 yards farther on, I found another wire cunningly placed on the edge of a small stream. Beyond that lay the moor, and in 5 minutes I was deep in bracken and heather. Soon I was round the shoulder of the rise, in the little glen from which the mill stream flowed. 10 minutes later my face was in the spring, and I was soaking down pints of the blessed water. But I did not stop until I had put 6 miles between me and that accursed dwelling. Chapter 7. The Dry-Fly Fisherman. I sat down on a hilltop to take stock of my position. I wasn't feeling very happy. My natural thankfulness for the escape was clouded by severe bodily discomfort. Those lentonite fumes had fairly poisoned me, and the baking hours in the dovecot hadn't helped. I had a crushing headache and felt sick as a cat. My shoulder was also in a bad way. At first I thought it was only a bruise, but it seemed to be swelling, and I had lost the use of my left arm. My plan was to seek Mr. Turnbull's cottage to recover my clothes and, more importantly, Scudder's notebook. Then I would make for the main train line and get back to the south. It seemed that the sooner I got in touch with the Foreign Office man, Sir Walter Bullivant, the better. I didn't see how I could gather more proof than I already had. He would just have to take or leave my story. In any case, I would be in better hands with him than with those devilish Germans. I had even begun to feel quite kindly towards the British police. It was a wonderful starry night, so finding the road wasn't difficult. Sir Harry's map had given me the lay of the land. All I had to do was steer slightly west or southwest to reach the stream where I had met the roadman. In all my travels, I never knew the names of these places, but I believe this stream was the upper water of the River Tweed. I calculated I was about 18 miles away, which meant I couldn't arrive before morning. I would have to lie low for a day, for I was too startling a figure to be seen in the sunlight. I had no coat, waistcoat, collar, or hat. My trousers were badly torn, and my face and hands were blackened by the explosion. I dare say I looked even worse, for my eyes felt furiously bloodshot. Altogether, I was no spectacle for God-fearing citizens to meet on a high road. Very soon after daybreak, I tried to clean myself in a hill stream, then approached a shepherd's cottage, feeling the need for food. The shepherd was away, and his wife was alone, with no neighbour for 5 miles. She was a decent old soul, and a plucky one. Though she was frightened when she saw me, she had an axe handy, and would have used it on any evildoer. I told her I'd had a fall. I didn't say how, and she saw by my looks that I was pretty sick. Like a true Samaritan, she asked no questions. She gave me a bowl of milk with a dash of whiskey, and let me sit for a while by her kitchen fire. She would have bathed my shoulder, but it ached so badly I wouldn't let her touch it. I don't know what she took me for. A repentant burglar, perhaps. When I wanted to pay for the milk and offered a sovereign, which was the smallest coin I had, she shook her head. She said something about giving it to them that had a right to it. I protested so strongly that I think she finally believed I was honest, for she took the money and gave me a warm new plaid shawl and an old hat of her husband's. She showed me how to wrap the plaid around my shoulders, and when I left that cottage, I was the living image of the kind of Scotsman you see in illustrations of Burns's poems. At any rate, I was more or less clad. It was just as well, for the weather changed before midday to a thick drizzle. I found shelter below an overhanging rock in the bend of a stream, where a drift of dead ferns made a tolerable bed. I managed to sleep there until nightfall, waking cramped and wretched, my shoulder gnawing like a toothache. I ate the oatcake and cheese the old woman had given me, and set out again just before dusk. I will pass over the miseries of that night among the wet hills. There were no stars to steer by, and I had to do my best from my memory of the map. Twice I lost my way, and I took some nasty falls into peat bogs. I only had about 10 miles to go in a straight line, but my mistakes made it nearer 20. The last stretch was completed with clenched teeth and a very light, dizzy head. But I managed it. In the early dawn, I was knocking at Mr. Turnbull's door. The mist lay close and thick. I couldn't even see the high road from the cottage. Mr. Turnbull himself opened the door, sober, and something more than sober. He was primarily dressed in an ancient but well-tended black suit. He had shaved the night before, wore a fresh linen collar, and carried a pocket Bible in his left hand. At first he didn't recognize me. "Where are ye that come stravaiging here on the Sabbath morning?" he asked. I had lost all count of the days. The Sabbath was the reason for this strange decorum. My head was swimming so wildly I couldn't frame a coherent answer. But then he recognized me and saw that I was ill. "Have you got my specs?" he asked. I fetched them out of my trouser pocket and handed them over. "Ye'll have come for your jacket and waistcoat," he said. "Come inside. Lord, man, you're terribly done in the legs. Hold up till I get you to a chair." I realized I was in for a bout of malaria. I had a good deal of fever in my bones, and the wet night had brought it out, while my shoulder and the fumes combined to make me feel terrible. Before I knew it, Mr. Turnbull was helping me off with my clothes and putting me to bed in one of the box beds built into the kitchen walls. He was a true friend in need, that old Roadman. His wife had died years ago, and since his daughter's marriage he lived alone. For the better part of 10 days he did all the rough nursing I needed. I simply wanted to be left in peace while the fever took its course. When my skin was cool again, I found the rest had more or less cured my shoulder. But it was a bad bout. Though I was out of bed in 5 days, it took time to get my legs back under me. He went out each morning, leaving me milk for the day and locking the door behind him, returning in the evening to sit silently in the chimney corner. Not a soul came near the place. When I was recovering, he never bothered me with questions. Several times he fetched me a 2-day-old newspaper, and I noticed the interest in the Portland Place murder seemed to have died down. There was no mention of it. I could find very little about anything except an event called the General Assembly, some ecclesiastical spree, I gathered. One day he produced my money belt from a locked drawer. "There's a terrible heap of silver in it," he said. "You'd better count it to see it's all there." He never even asked my name. I asked him if anyone had been around making inquiries after my time at the road-making. "Aye, there was a man in a motor car," he said. He asked who had taken my place that day, and I let on that I thought him daft. But he kept at me, and eventually I said he must be thinking of my brother-in-law, who sometimes lends me a hand. He was a sour-looking soul, and I couldn't understand half his English tongue. I was getting restless in those last days, and as soon as I felt fit, I decided to be off. That wasn't until the 12th of June. As luck would have it, a drover named Hislop, a friend of Turnbull's, passed by that morning taking cattle to Moffat. He came in for breakfast and offered to take me with him. I made Turnbull accept £5 for my lodging, and I had a hard job of it. There never was a more independent being. He grew positively rude when I pressed him, turning shy and red, and finally took the money without a thank you. When I told him how much I owed him, he grunted something about one good turn deserving another. You would have thought from our leave-taking that we had parted in disgust. Hislop was a cheery soul who chatted all the way over the pass and down the sunny valley. I talked of markets and sheep prices, and he made up his mind I was a shepherd from Galloway. My plaid and old hat gave me a fine theatrical Scots look. But driving cattle is a mortally slow job, and we took the better part of the day to cover a dozen miles. If I hadn't had such an anxious heart, I would have enjoyed that time. It was shining blue weather, with a constantly changing view of brown hills, far green meadows, and the continual sound of larks and falling streams. But I had no mind for summer and little for Hislop's conversation. As the fateful 15th of June drew near, I was weighed down by the hopeless difficulties of my enterprise. I got some dinner in a humble pub in Moffat, and walked the 2 miles to the junction on the main line. The night express for the south wasn't due until near midnight. To kill time, I went up on the hillside and fell asleep, for the walk had tired me. I nearly slept too long and had to run to the station, catching the train with 2 minutes to spare. The feel of the hard third-class cushions and the smell of stale tobacco cheered me up wonderfully. At any rate, I felt I was finally getting to grips with my job. I was dropped off at Crewe in the small hours and had to wait until 6 for a train to Birmingham. In the afternoon, I reached Reading and changed into a local train that journeyed into the deeps of Berkshire. Presently, I was in a land of lush water meadows and slow, reedy streams. About 8 o'clock in the evening, a weary and travel-stained being, looking like a cross between a farm labourer and a vet, with a checked plaid over his arm, stepped off at the little station of Artenswell. There were people on the platform, so I thought I had better wait to ask my way until I was clear of the place. The road led through a wood of great beeches and then into a shallow valley, with the green backs of the downs peeping over distant trees. After Scotland, the air smelled heavy and flat, but infinitely sweet, for the limes and chestnuts were in full blossom. Presently I came to a bridge. Below it, a clear, slow stream flowed between snowy beds of water buttercups. A little above was a mill, and the water rushing over the weir made a pleasant, cool sound in the scented dusk. Somehow the place soothed me and put me at ease. I began to whistle as I looked into the green depths, and the tune that came to my lips was Annie Laurie. A fisherman came up from the waterside, and as he neared me, he began to whistle too. The tune was infectious. He was a huge man in untidy old flannels and a wide-brimmed hat, with a canvas bag slung on his shoulder. He nodded to me, and I thought I had never seen a shrewder or better-tempered face. He leaned his delicate fishing rod against the bridge and looked with me at the water. "Clear, isn't it?" he said pleasantly. "I'd back our River Kennet any day against the test. Look at that big fellow. £4 if he's an ounce. But the evening rise is over, and you can't tempt them." "I don't see him," I said. "Look, there, a yard from the reeds, just above that patch of fast water. I've got him now. You might swear he was a black stone." "So," he said, and whistled another bar of Annie Laurie. He spoke over his shoulder, his eyes still fixed on the stream. "Twisden's the name, isn't it?" "No," I said. "I mean to say, yes. I had forgotten all about my alias." "It's a wise conspirator who knows his own name," he observed, grinning broadly at a moorhen emerging from the bridge's shadow. I stood up and looked at him. I took in the square, cleft jaw, the broad, lined brow, and the firm folds of his cheek. I began to think that here, at last, was an ally worth having. His whimsical blue eyes seemed to go very deep. Suddenly he frowned. "I call it disgraceful," he said, raising his voice so anyone nearby could hear. "Disgraceful that an able-bodied man like you should dare to beg. You can get a meal from my kitchen, but you'll get no money from me." A cart was passing, driven by a young man who raised his whip to salute the fisherman. When the cart had gone, the fisherman picked up his rod. "That's my house," he said quietly, pointing to a white gate 100 yards away. "Wait 5 minutes, then go round to the back door." With that, he left me. I did as I was told. I found a pretty cottage with a lawn running down to the stream, and a perfect jungle of flowering shrubs and lilacs flanking the path. The back door stood open, and a grave butler was waiting for me. "Come this way, sir," he said. He led me along a passage and up a back staircase to a pleasant bedroom looking out toward the river. There I found a complete outfit laid out for me: dress clothes with all the trimmings, a brown flannel suit, shirts, collars, ties, shaving supplies, and hairbrushes. There was even a pair of patent leather shoes. "Sir Walter thought Mr. Reggie's things would fit you, sir," the butler said. "He keeps some clothes here, as he visits regularly on weekends. There's a bathroom next door, and I've prepared a hot bath. Dinner is in half an hour, sir. You'll hear the gong." The grave figure withdrew. I sat down in a floral easy chair and gaped. It was like a pantomime transformation, to come suddenly out of beggardom into this orderly comfort. Obviously, Sir Walter believed in me, though why he did, I could not guess. I looked at myself in the mirror. I saw a wild, haggard, brown fellow with a fortnight's ragged beard. There was dust in my ears and eyes. I was collarless, wearing a cheap shirt, shapeless old tweed clothes, and boots that hadn't been cleaned for the better part of a month. I made a fine tramp and a fair drover, yet here I was, ushered by a prim butler into this temple of gracious ease. And the best of it was, they didn't even know my name. I resolved not to puzzle my head over it, but to take the gifts the gods had provided. I shaved and bathed luxuriously, then got into the dress clothes and the clean, crackling shirt, which fitted me reasonably well. By the time I had finished, the looking-glass showed a not unpresentable young man. Sir Walter awaited me in a dusky dining-room where a small round table was lit with silver candles. The sight of him, so respectable, established, and secure, the very embodiment of law and government, took me aback. It made me feel like an interloper. He couldn't know the truth about me, or he wouldn't treat me like this. I simply could not accept his hospitality on false pretenses. "I'm more obliged to you than I can say, but I'm bound to make things clear," I said. "I'm an innocent man, but I'm wanted by the police. I've got to tell you this, and I won't be surprised if you kick me out." He smiled. "That's all right. Don't let that interfere with your appetite. We can talk about these things after dinner." I never ate a meal with greater relish, for I had had nothing all day but railway sandwiches. Sir Walter treated me well. We drank good champagne and had some excellent port afterward. It made me almost hysterical to be sitting there, waited on by a footman and a sleek butler, remembering that only yesterday I had been living like a brigand with every man's hand against me. We chatted about travel and sport. I told Sir Walter about tigerfish in the Zambezi that bite off your fingers if you give them a chance, and we discussed hunting up and down the globe. We went to his study for coffee, a jolly room full of books, trophies, untidiness, and comfort. I decided that if I ever got out of this business and had a house of my own, I would create just such a room. When the coffee cups were cleared away and we had our cigars lit, my host swung his long legs over the side of his chair and asked me to start my story. "I've obeyed Harry's instructions," he said. "The bribe he offered was that you would tell me something to wake me up. "I'm ready, Mr. Hannay." I noticed with a start that he called me by my proper name. I began at the very beginning. I told him of my boredom in London, and the night I came back to find Scudder gibbering on my doorstep. I told him everything Scudder had told me about Carolides and the Foreign Office Conference, that made him purse his lips and grin. Then I got to the murder, and he grew solemn again. He heard all about the Milkman, my time in Galloway, and my deciphering of Scudder's notes at the inn. "You've got them here?" he asked sharply. He drew a long breath when I whipped the little book from my pocket. I said nothing of the contents yet. Instead, I described my meeting with Sir Harry and the speeches at the hall. At that, he laughed uproariously. "Harry talked absolute nonsense, did he? I quite believe it. He's as good a chap as ever breathed, but his idiot uncle has stuffed his head with crazy ideas. Go on, Mr. Hannay. My day as a road worker excited him a bit." He made me describe the two fellows in the car very closely, and seemed to be raking back through his memory. He grew merry again when he heard of the fate of that fool Jopley, but the old man in the moorland house made him solemn. Again, I had to describe every detail of his appearance. "Bland and bald-headed, and hooded his eyes like a bird," he mused. "He sounds like a sinister character. And you dynamited his hermitage after he had saved you from the police. A spirited piece of work, that." Presently, I reached the end of my wanderings. He stood up slowly and looked down at me from the hearthrug. "You may dismiss the police from your mind," he said. "You are in no danger from the law of this land." "Great Scott!" I cried. "Have they caught the murderer?" "No, but for the last fortnight they have dropped you from the list of suspects." "Why?" I asked in amazement. "Principally because I received a letter from Scudder. I knew something about the man, and he did several jobs for me. He was half crank, half genius, but wholly honest. The trouble was his tendency to work alone. That made him pretty well useless in any secret service. A pity, for he had uncommon gifts. I think he was the bravest man in the world, for he was always shivering with fright, yet nothing would stop him. I got a letter from him on the 31st of May, but he had been dead a week by then. The letter was written and posted on the 23rd. He evidently did not anticipate an immediate death. His communications usually took a week to reach me, as they were sent under cover to Spain and then to Newcastle. He had a mania for concealing his tracks. What did he say? I stammered. Nothing. Merely that he was in danger, but had found shelter with a good friend, and that I would hear from him before the 15th of June. He gave no address, but said he was living near Portland Place. I think his object was to clear you if anything happened. When I received the letter, I went to Scotland Yard, reviewed the details of the inquest, and concluded that you were the friend. We made inquiries about you, Mr. Hannay, and found you were respectable. I thought I knew the motives for your disappearance, not just the police, but the other danger too. When I got Harry's scrawl, I guessed the rest. I have been expecting you any time this past week. You can imagine what a load this took off my mind. I felt a free man once more. I was now up against my country's enemies only, and not my country's law. "Now," said Sir Walter, "let us have the little notebook." It took us a good hour to work through it. I explained the cipher, and he was very quick at picking it up. He corrected my reading on several points, but I had been fairly accurate on the whole. His face was very grave before he had finished, and he sat silent for a while. "I don't know what to make of it," he said at last. "He is right about one thing. What is going to happen the day after tomorrow? How could the devil have become known? That is ugly enough in itself. But all this about war and the Black Stone, it reads like some wild melodrama. If only I had more confidence in Scudder's judgment. The trouble was, he was too romantic. He had an artistic temperament and wanted a story to be better than reality. He had a lot of odd biases, too. Jews, for example, made him see red. Jews and high finance. The Black Stone, he repeated. Der Schwarz Stein. It's like a cheap thriller. And all this stuff about Carolides. That is the weak part of the tale, for I happen to know that the virtuous Carolides is likely to outlast us both. There is no state in Europe that wants him gone. Besides, he has just been playing up to Berlin and Vienna, and giving my chief some uneasy moments. No, Scudder has gone off the track there. Frankly, Hannay, I don't believe that part of his story. There's some nasty business afoot, and he found out too much and lost his life over it. But I'm ready to take my oath that it is ordinary spy work. A certain great European power makes a hobby of her spy system, and her methods are not too particular. They want our naval dispositions for their collection, but those will simply be filed away, nothing more. Just then, the butler entered the room. "There's a long-distance call from London, Sir Walter. It's Mr. Heath, and he wants to speak to you personally." My host went off to the telephone. He returned in 5 minutes with a pale face. "I apologize to the spirit of Scudder," he said. "Carolides was shot dead this evening, a few minutes after 7. Chapter 8. The Coming of the Black Stone. I came down to breakfast the next morning after 8 hours of blessed, dreamless sleep to find Sir Walter decoding a telegram amidst the muffins and marmalade. His fresh rosiness of the day before seemed a little tarnished. "I had a busy hour on the telephone after you went to bed," he said. "I got my chief to speak to the First Lord and the Secretary for War, and they are bringing Royer over a day sooner. This wire clinches it. He will be in London at 5. Odd that the code word for a French general should be porker." He pointed me toward the hot dishes and went on. "Not that I think it will do much good. If your friends were clever enough to find out the first arrangement, they are clever enough to discover the change. I would give my head to know where the leak is. We believed there were only 5 men in England who knew about Royer's visit, and you may be certain there were fewer in France, for they manage these things better there." While I ate, he continued to talk, making me a present of his full confidence. "Can the plans not be changed?" I asked. "They could," he said, "but we want to avoid that if possible. They are the result of immense thought, and no alteration would be as good. Besides, on 1 or 2 points, change is simply impossible. Still, something could be done if it were absolutely necessary. But you see the difficulty, Hannay. Our enemies are not going to be such fools as to pick Royer's pocket or play any childish game like that. They know that would cause an uproar and put us on our guard. Their aim is to get the details without any of us knowing, so that Royer will go back to Paris believing the whole business is still a deadly secret. If they can't do that, they fail. Once we suspect, they know the whole thing must be altered. Then we must stick by the Frenchman's side until he is home again," I said. "If they thought they could get the information in Paris, they would try there. It means they have some deep scheme on foot in London, which they reckon is going to succeed. Royer dines with my chief, and then comes to my house where 4 people will see him: Whittaker from the Admiralty, myself, Sir Arthur Drew, and General Winstanley. The First Lord is ill and has gone to Sheringham. At my house, Royer will get a certain document from Whitaker, and after that he will be driven to Portsmouth, where a destroyer will take him to Le Havre. His journey is too important for the ordinary boat train. He will never be left unattended for a moment until he is safe on French soil. The same goes for Whitaker until he meets Royer. That is the best we can do, and it's hard to see how anything can go wrong. But I don't mind admitting that I'm horribly nervous. This murder of Carolides will play the devil in the chancelleries of Europe. After breakfast, he asked me if I could drive a car. Well, you'll be my chauffeur today and wear Hudson's uniform. You're about his size. You have a hand in this business, and we are taking no risks. There are desperate men against us who will not respect the country retreat of an overworked official. When I first came to London, I had bought a car and amused myself by driving about the south of England, so I knew the geography. I took Sir Walter to town by the Bath Road and had a good time. It was a soft, breathless June morning, with a promise of heat later, but it was delicious enough swinging through the little towns with their freshly watered streets and past the summer gardens of the Thames Valley. I dropped Sir Walter at his house in Queen Anne's Gate punctually at 11:30. The butler was coming up by train with the luggage. The first thing Sir Walter did was take me round to Scotland Yard. There we saw a prim gentleman with a clean-shaven, lawyer's face. "I've brought you the Portland Place murderer," was Sir Walter's introduction. The reply was a wry smile. "It would have been a welcome present, Bullivant. This, I presume, is Mr. Richard Hannay, who for some days greatly interested my department. Mr. Hannay will be interested in it again. He has much to tell you, but not today. For certain grave reasons, his tale must wait for 4 hours. Then, I can promise you, you will be entertained and possibly edified. I want you to assure Mr. Hannay that he will suffer no further inconvenience." This assurance was promptly given. "You can take up your life where you left off," I was told. "Your flat, which you probably no longer wish to occupy, is waiting for you, and your man is still there. As you were never publicly accused, we considered there was no need for a public statement clearing your name. But on that, of course, you must please yourself. We may want your assistance later on, MacGillivray," Sir Walter said as we left. Then he turned me loose. "Come and see me tomorrow, Hannay. I needn't tell you to keep deadly quiet. If I were you, I would go to bed, for you must have considerable sleep to catch up on. You had better lie low, for if one of your Blackstone friends saw you there might be trouble." I felt curiously at a loose end. At first, it was very pleasant to be a free man, able to go where I wanted without fearing anything. I had only been under the ban of the law for a month, but that was quite enough for me. I went to the Savoy and ordered a very good luncheon, then smoked the best cigar the house could provide. But I was still feeling nervous. When I saw anybody look at me in the lounge, I grew shy and wondered if they were thinking about the murder. After that, I took a taxi and drove miles up into North London. I walked back through fields and lines of villas, then slums and mean streets. It took me nearly 2 hours. All the while, my restlessness was growing worse. I felt that great, tremendous things were happening or about to happen, and I, who was the cogwheel of the whole business, was out of it. Royer would be landing at Dover. Sir Walter would be making plans with a few people in England who were in the secret, and somewhere in the darkness the Black Stone would be working. I felt a sense of danger and impending calamity. I had the curious feeling that I alone could avert it, alone could grapple with it. But I was out of the game now. How could it be otherwise? It was unlikely that cabinet ministers and admiralty lords would admit me to their councils. I actually began to wish I could run up against one of my three enemies. That would lead to developments. I felt that I wanted enormously to have a vulgar fist-fight with those gentry, where I could hit out and flatten something. I was rapidly getting into a very bad temper. I didn't feel like going back to my flat. That had to be faced sometime, but as I still had sufficient money, I thought I would put it off until the next morning and go to a hotel for the night. My irritation lasted through dinner, which I had at a restaurant in Jermyn Street. I was no longer hungry, and let several courses pass untasted. I drank the best part of a bottle of Burgundy, but it did nothing to cheer me up. An abominable restlessness had taken possession of me. Here I was, a very ordinary fellow with no particular brains, and yet I was convinced that somehow I was needed to help this business through, that without me it would all go to blazes. I told myself it was sheer silly conceit, that 4 or 5 of the cleverest people living, with all the might of the British Empire at their back, had the job in hand. Yet I couldn't be convinced. It seemed as if a voice kept speaking in my ear, telling me to be up and doing, or I would never sleep again. The upshot was that about 9:30 I made up my mind to go to Queen Anne's Gate. Very likely I would not be admitted, but it would ease my conscience to try. I walked down Jermyn Street, and at the corner of Duke Street I passed a group of young men. They were in evening dress, had been dining somewhere, and were going on to a music hall. One of them was Mr. Marmaduke Jopley. He saw me and stopped short. "By God, the murderer!" he cried. "Here, you fellows, hold him. That's Hannay, the man who did the Portland Place murder." He gripped me by the arm, and the others crowded round. I wasn't looking for trouble, but my ill temper made me play the fool. A policeman came up, and I should have told him the truth. But delay at that moment seemed unendurable, and the sight of Marmy's imbecile face was more than I could bear. I let out with my left, and had the satisfaction of seeing him sprawl in the gutter. Then began an unholy row. They were all on me at once, and the policeman took me from the rear. I got in 1 or 2 good blows. I think with fair play I could have beaten a lot of them, but the policeman pinned me from behind, and one of them got his fingers on my throat. Through a black cloud of rage, I heard the officer asking what was the matter, and Marmy, between his broken teeth, declared that I was Hannay the murderer. "Oh, damn it all!" I cried. "Make the fellow shut up. I advise you to leave me alone. Constable, Scotland Yard knows all about me, and you'll get in proper trouble if you interfere." "You've got to come along with me, young man," said the policeman. "I saw you strike that gentleman cruelly. You began it too, for he wasn't doing nothing. Best go quietly, or I'll have to fix you up." Exasperation and an overwhelming sense that I must not delay gave me the strength of a bull elephant. I wrenched the constable off his feet, floored the man who was gripping my collar, and set off at my best pace down Duke Street. I heard a whistle being blown and the rush of men behind me. I had a very fair turn of speed, and that night I had wings. In a jiffy, I was in Pall Mall and turned down towards St. James's Park. I dodged the policeman at the palace gates, dived through traffic at the entrance to the mall, and made for the bridge before my pursuers had crossed the roadway. In the open ways of the park, I put on a spurt. Happily, there were few people around, and no one tried to stop me. I was betting everything on getting to Queen Anne's Gate. When I entered that quiet street, it seemed deserted. Sir Walter's house was in the narrow part, and outside it 3 or 4 cars were drawn up. I slackened speed some yards off and walked briskly up to the door. If the butler refused me admission, or if he even delayed opening the door, I was done. He didn't delay. I had scarcely rung before the door opened. "I must see Sir Walter," I panted. "My business is desperately important." That butler was a great man. Without moving a muscle, he held the door open and then shut it behind me. "Sir Walter is engaged, sir, and I have orders to admit no one. Perhaps you will wait." The house was of the old-fashioned kind, with a wide hall and rooms on both sides. At the far end was an alcove with a telephone and a couple of chairs, and there the butler offered me a seat. "See here," I whispered, "there's trouble about, and I'm in it. But Sir Walter knows, and I'm working for him. If anyone comes and asks if I am here, tell him a lie." He nodded. Presently there was a noise of voices in the street and a furious ringing at the bell. I never admired a man more than that butler. He opened the door, and with a face like a stone statue, waited to be questioned. Then he gave it to them. He told them whose house it was and what his orders were, and simply froze them off the doorstep. I could see it all from my alcove, and it was better than any play. I hadn't waited long when there came another ring at the bell. The butler made no bones about admitting this new visitor. While he was taking off his coat, I saw who it was. You couldn't open a newspaper without seeing that face. The grey beard cut like a spade, the firm fighting mouth, the blunt square nose, and the keen blue eyes. I recognized the First Sea Lord, the man they say made the new British Navy. He passed my alcove and was ushered into a room at the back of the hall. As the door opened, I could hear the sound of low voices. It shut, and I was left alone again. For 20 minutes I sat there, wondering what I was to do next. I was still convinced that I was wanted, but when or how, I had no notion. I kept looking at my watch. As the time crept on to 10:30, I began to think the conference must soon end. In a quarter of an hour, Royer should be speeding along the road to Portsmouth. Then I heard a bell ring, and the butler appeared. The door of the back room opened, and the First Sea Lord came out. He walked past me, and in passing he glanced in my direction. For a second we looked each other in the face. Only for a second, but it was enough to make my heart jump. I had never seen the great man before, and he had never seen me. But in that fraction of time something sprang into his eyes, and that something was recognition. You can't mistake it. It is a flicker, a spark of light, a minute shade of difference which means one thing and one thing only. It came involuntarily, for in a moment it died, and he passed on. In a maze of wild fancies, I heard the street door close behind him. I picked up the telephone book and looked up the number of his house. We were connected at once, and I heard a servant's voice. "Is his lordship at home?" I asked. "His lordship returned half an hour ago," said the voice, "and has gone to bed. He is not very well tonight. Will you leave a message, sir?" I rang off and almost tumbled into a chair. My part in this business has not yet ended. It had been a close shave, but I had been in time. Not a moment could be lost. I marched boldly to the door of that back room and entered without knocking. 5 surprised faces looked up from a round table. There was Sir Walter, and Drew the War Minister, whom I knew from his photographs. There was a slim elderly man who was probably Whitaker, the Admiralty official, and General Winstanley, conspicuous by the long scar on his forehead. Lastly, there was a short, stout man with an iron-grey moustache and bushy eyebrows, who had been arrested in the middle of a sentence. Sir Walter's face showed surprise and annoyance. "This is Mr. Hannay, of whom I have spoken to you," he said apologetically to the company. "I'm afraid, Hannay, this visit is ill-timed. I was getting back my cool." "That remains to be seen, sir," I said, "but I think it may be in the nick of time. For God's sake, gentlemen, tell me who went out a minute ago." "Lord Allo," Sir Walter said, reddening with anger. "It was not," I cried. "It was his living image, but it was not Lord Allo. It was someone who recognized me, someone I have seen in the last month." He had scarcely left the doorstep when I rang Lord Allo's house, and was told he had come in half an hour before and gone to bed. Who? Someone stammered. "The Black Stone," I cried. I sat down in the chair so recently vacated, and looked round at 5 badly scared gentlemen. Chapter 9. The 39 Steps. "Nonsense!" the Admiralty official snapped. Sir Walter rose and left the room while we stared blankly at the table. He returned 10 minutes later, looking grim. "I spoke to Allo," he said. "Dragged him out of bed. He was very grumpy. He went straight home after Mulross's dinner." "It's madness," General Winstanley broke in. "You mean to tell me that man sat beside me for half an hour, and I didn't detect the fraud? Allo must be out of his mind. Don't you see how clever it is?" I said. "You were too focused on other things to notice. You took Lord Allo for granted. If it had been anyone else, you might have looked closer, but his presence felt natural, and that put you all to sleep." Then the Frenchman spoke, slowly and in good English. "The young man is right. His psychology is sound. Our enemies are not fools." He fixed his gaze on the assembly. "I will tell you a story. It happened years ago in Senegal. I was stationed at a remote post, and often fished for barbel in the river. A little Arab mare used to carry my lunch-basket. One morning the mare was unaccountably restless. I heard her whinnying and stamping, and I soothed her with my voice while I focused on the fish. I thought I could see her out of the corner of my eye, tethered to a tree 20 yards away." He paused. "After 2 hours I thought of food. I gathered my catch in a bag and walked toward the mare. When I reached her, I flung the bag onto her back." He looked around the room. "The smell gave me a warning. I turned my head and found myself staring at a lion 3 feet away. The terror of the village. Behind him lay what was left of the mare, a mass of blood and bone. What happened?" I asked. "I shoved my fishing rod into his jaws, and I had a pistol. My servants arrived with rifles, but he left his mark on me." He held up a hand, missing 3 fingers. "Consider this," he said. "The mare had been dead for an hour, and the brute had been watching me the whole time. I never saw the kill because I was used to the mare fretting. I never noticed her absence because my awareness of her was just a tawny shape, and the lion filled that space perfectly. If I could blunder like that in the wild, where senses are keen, why wouldn't we busy urban folk make the same mistake?" Sir Walter nodded. No one contradicted him. "But I don't see," Winstanley said. "Their goal was to learn our dispositions without us knowing. Now, if one of us mentioned tonight's meeting to the real Allo, the fraud is exposed." Sir Walter laughed dryly. "Choosing Allo shows their genius. Which of us would speak to him about tonight? And he certainly wouldn't bring it up." I remembered the First Sea Lord's reputation for silence and short temper. "One thing puzzles me," the General said. "What good does this visit do the spy?" He couldn't carry pages of figures and names in his head. "That is not difficult," the Frenchman replied. A good spy is trained to have a photographic memory. You noticed he said nothing, but studied the papers repeatedly. We can assume every detail is stamped on his mind. "I suppose we must change the plans," Sir Walter said ruefully. Whitaker looked glum. "Did you tell Lord Allow what happened?" "No. I can't be certain, but I doubt we can make serious changes unless we alter the geography of England." "Something else must be said," Royer added. "I spoke freely when that man was here. I revealed military secrets worth millions to our enemies. There is no other way. The man and his confederates must be captured immediately." "Good God!" I cried. "We don't have a clue." "Besides," Whitaker said, "the news will be in the post by now." "No," the Frenchman corrected. "You do not understand the spy. He receives his reward personally and delivers his intelligence personally. There is still a chance. These men must cross the sea. Ships can be searched. Ports can be watched. Believe me, the need is desperate." Royer's calm sense pulled us together. He was a man of action among fumblers, but I saw no hope in the others. Where, among 50 million people, could we find 3 clever rogues in a dozen hours? Suddenly, I had an inspiration. "Where is Scudder's book?" I asked Sir Walter. "Quick, I remember something." He unlocked a bureau and handed it to me. I found the place. 39 steps, I read. I counted them. High tide, 10:17 p.m. The Admiralty man looked at me as if I were mad. "Don't you see?" I shouted. Scudder knew where these fellows hid. He knew where they planned to leave the country. Tomorrow is the day, and it's a place where the high tide is at 10:17. "They might have gone tonight," someone said. "No, they have their own secret route and won't be rushed. I know Germans. They work to a plan. Where can I get a book of tide tables?" Whitaker brightened. "It's a chance. Let's go to the Admiralty." We took 2 waiting cars, except for Sir Walter, who went to Scotland Yard to mobilize the police. We marched through empty corridors to a small room lined with maps. A clerk fetched the Admiralty tide tables. I sat at the desk while the others stood around. Somehow I had taken charge of the expedition. But it was no good. There were hundreds of entries. 10:17 might cover 50 places. We had to narrow the possibilities. I held my head in my hands. What did Scudder mean by steps? I thought of dock steps, but he wouldn't have mentioned the number. It must be a place with several staircases, where one is marked by having 39 steps. I checked the steamer sailings. No boat left for the continent at 10:17. Why was the tide so important? It had to be a small harbour where the tide mattered, or perhaps no harbour at all, just open coast. I considered the geography. A man in a hurry, leaving London for Germany, wouldn't use the big harbours, the Channel, or the West Coast. I measured the map. He would try for Ostend or Rotterdam, sailing from the east coast between Cromer and Dover. It was loose guessing, and I'm no Sherlock Holmes, but I've always had an instinct for these things. When my brain hits a wall, I guess, and usually I'm right. I wrote my conclusions on a sheet of paper. Fairly certain, a place with multiple staircases, one with 39 steps. Leaving shore is only possible at full tide, 10:17 p.m. Not a harbour, but an open coast. Transport by yacht or fishing boat. Guessed, east coast, between Cromer and Dover. It struck me as odd, sitting there with cabinet ministers and generals, trying to drag a secret from a dead man's scribble that meant life or death for us all. Sir Walter arrived with MacGillivray, who had issued watch orders for the ports. "Here's the best I can do," I said. "We need a place with cliffs and staircases down to the beach, somewhere between the Wash and the Channel, with a high tide at 10:17 tomorrow." Then I asked, "Is there an inspector of coast guards who knows the East Coast?" Whitaker knew a man in Clapham and went to fetch him. We waited, smoking and talking, until the coast guard arrived at 1 in the morning. He was a fine old fellow, looking like a naval officer. "We need to know," I said, "places on the East Coast with cliffs and several sets of steps running down to the beach." He thought for a moment. "Do you mean roads cut through cliffs, or regular staircases?" "Regular staircases," I replied. "Well," he said, "there's a place in Norfolk near a golf course." "That's not it," I said. "There are plenty of marine parades," he offered. "It has to be more retired than that." "I can't think of anywhere else," he said, "unless there's the Rough." "What's that?" "A big chalk headland in Kent, close to Bradgate. It has villas on top, and some houses have private staircases to the beach. Very high-toned. Residents keep to themselves." I tore open the tide tables. High tide at Bradgate was 10:27 p.m. on June 15th. "We're close," I said excitedly. "What's the tide at the Rough?" "I can tell you that," the Coast Guard said. "I used to fish there. The tide is 10 minutes before Bradgate." I closed the book and looked at the company. If one of those staircases has 39 steps, we have solved the mystery. "I need your car, Sir Walter, and a map. If Mr. MacGillivray spares me 10 minutes, we can prepare." It was ridiculous for me to take charge, but these eminent gentlemen didn't seem to mind. General Royer gave the final nod. I am content to leave the matter in Mr. Hannay's hands. By 3:30, I was tearing past the moonlit hedgerows of Kent, with MacGillivray's best man beside me. Chapter 10. Various parties converging on the sea. A pink and blue June morning found me at Bradgate, looking from the Griffin Hotel over a smooth sea. The lightship on the Cock Sands seemed no larger than a bell buoy. A couple of miles farther south, and much nearer the shore, a small destroyer lay at anchor. Scaife, MacGillivray's man, knew the boat and her commander, so I sent a wire to Sir Walter. After breakfast, Scaife obtained a key for the gates of the staircases on the Rough from a local house agent. I walked with him along the sands and sat in a nook of the cliffs while he investigated them. I didn't want to be seen, but the place was deserted at that hour. All the time I waited on that beach, I saw nothing but seagulls. It took him more than an hour. When I saw him coming toward me, studying a scrap of paper, my heart was in my mouth. Everything depended on my guess being right. He read aloud the number of steps in the different staircases. 34, 35, 39, 42, 47, and one with 21 where the cliffs grew lower. I almost shouted with relief. We hurried back to the town and wired MacGillivray. I asked for 6 men, directing them to split up among different hotels. Then Scaife set out to scout the house at the head of the 39 steps. He came back with news that both puzzled and reassured me. The house was called Trafalgar Lodge. It belonged to a Mr. Appleton, a retired stockbroker. The agent said he was a decent old fellow who was there a good deal in the summer, paid his bills regularly, and was always good for a fiver for local charity. Scaife had gone to the back door, pretending to be a sewing-machine agent. The 3 servants, a cook, a parlour-maid, and a housemaid, were exactly the sort you would find in a respectable middle-class household. The cook wasn't the gossiping kind and shut the door in his face, but Scaife was positive she knew nothing. Next door, a new house was being built which would provide cover for observation, and the villa on the other side was to let its garden rough and shrubby. I borrowed Scaife's telescope and went for a walk along the rough. Keeping well behind the rows of villas, I found a good vantage point on the edge of the golf course. I could see the line of turf along the cliff top, the benches placed at intervals, and the little square plots where the staircases descended to the beach. I saw Trafalgar Lodge very plainly. It was a red brick villa with a veranda, a tennis lawn behind, and a front garden full of marguerites and scraggy geraniums. From a flagstaff, an enormous Union Jack hung limply in the still air. Presently, someone left the house and sauntered along the cliff. Through my glasses, I saw it was an old man wearing white flannel trousers, a blue serge jacket, and a straw hat. He carried field glasses and a newspaper. He sat on one of the iron seats, reading, and occasionally turning his glasses on the sea. He watched the destroyer for a long time. I watched him for half an hour until he returned to the house for lunch. I wasn't feeling very confident. This decent, commonplace dwelling was not what I had expected. The man might be the bald archaeologist from that horrible moorland farm, or he might not. He was exactly the kind of satisfied old bird you find in every suburb. If you wanted a type of perfectly harmless person, you would probably pick him. But after lunch, as I sat on the hotel porch, I perked up. I saw the thing I had hoped for and dreaded to miss. A yacht came up from the south and dropped anchor opposite the Rough. She seemed about 150 tons, and I saw from the white ensign that she belonged to the squadron. Scaife and I went down to the harbour and hired a boatman for an afternoon's fishing. We caught about 20 pounds of cod and lythe, and out on that dancing blue sea, I took a cheerier view of things. Above the white cliffs, I saw the green and red of the villas, and especially the great flagstaff of Trafalgar Lodge. About 4 o'clock, I had the boatman row us around the yacht. She lay like a delicate white bird, ready to flee at a moment's notice. Her name was the Ariadne. I spoke to one of the men polishing brasswork, and got an answer in the soft dialect of Essex. Another hand passed the time of day in unmistakable English. Then the men suddenly ignored us and bent to their work as an officer came along the deck. He was a pleasant, clean-looking young fellow, and he asked about our fishing in very good English. But there was no doubt about him. His close-cropped head and the cut of his collar never came out of England. That reassured me, but as we rowed back to Bradgate, my obstinate doubts returned. My enemies knew I had gotten my information from Scudder, and Scudder had given me the clue to this place. If they knew Scudder had this clue, wouldn't they change their plans? Too much depended on their success to take risks. I wondered if the man from the night before had recognized me. Somehow I didn't think so, and I clung to that hope. But the business had never seemed so difficult as it did that afternoon. By all calculations, I should have been rejoicing in success. I spent an hour or two watching Trafalgar Lodge from the garden of the empty house next door. I had a full view of the court where two figures were playing tennis. One was the old man I had seen earlier. The other was a younger fellow wearing a club scarf around his waist. They played with tremendous zest, like two city gents wanting hard exercise. You couldn't conceive a more innocent spectacle. They shouted and laughed and stopped for drinks when a maid brought out tankards on a tray. I rubbed my eyes. Was I the greatest fool on earth? Mystery and darkness had hung about the men who hunted me over the Scotch moors. It was easy to connect them with the knife that killed Scudder, and with designs on the world's peace. But here were two guileless citizens taking their exercise, soon to go indoors to a humdrum dinner and talk of market prices and cricket scores. I had built a net to catch vultures, and lo and behold, two plump thrushes had blundered into it. Presently a third figure arrived, a young man on a bicycle with golf clubs on his back. He strolled to the lawn and was welcomed riotously. They chaffed him, and it sounded horribly English. Then the plump man, mopping his brow, announced he needed a bath. "I've got into a proper lather," I heard him say. "This will bring down my weight and my handicap, Bob. I'll take you tomorrow and give you a stroke." You couldn't find anything more English than that. They went into the house, leaving me feeling like an idiot. I had been barking up the wrong tree. These men might be acting, but where was their audience? They didn't know I was sitting 30 yards away in a rhododendron bush. It was impossible to believe these three hearty fellows were anything but what they seemed, ordinary, game-playing, suburban Englishmen. Chapter 10. Various parties converging on the sea. A pink and blue June morning found me at Bradgate, looking from the Griffin Hotel over a smooth sea. The lightship on the Cock Sands seemed no larger than a bell buoy. A couple of miles farther south, and much nearer the shore, a small destroyer lay at anchor. Scaife, MacGillivray's man, knew the boat and her commander, so I sent a wire to Sir Walter. After breakfast, Scaife obtained a key for the gates of the staircases on the Rough from a local house agent. I walked with him along the sands and sat in a nook of the cliffs while he investigated them. I didn't want to be seen, but the place was deserted at that hour. All the time I waited on that beach, I saw nothing but seagulls. It took him more than an hour. When I saw him coming toward me, studying a scrap of paper, my heart was in my mouth. Everything depended on my guess being right. He read aloud the number of steps in the different staircases. 34, 35, 39, 42, 47, and one with 21 where the cliffs grew lower. I almost shouted with relief. We hurried back to the town and wired MacGillivray. I asked for 6 men, directing them to split up among different hotels. Then Scaife set out to scout the house at the head of the 39 steps. He came back with news that both puzzled and reassured me. The house was called Trafalgar Lodge. It belonged to a Mr. Appleton, a retired stockbroker. The agent said he was a decent old fellow who was there a good deal in the summer, paid his bills regularly, and was always good for a fiver for local charity. Scaife had gone to the back door, pretending to be a sewing-machine agent. The 3 servants, a cook, a parlour-maid, and a housemaid, were exactly the sort you would find in a respectable middle-class household. The cook wasn't the gossiping kind and shut the door in his face, but Scaife was positive she knew nothing. Next door, a new house was being built which would provide cover for observation, and the villa on the other side was to let its garden rough and shrubby. I borrowed Scaife's telescope and went for a walk along the Rough. Keeping well behind the rows of villas, I found a good vantage point on the edge of the golf course. I could see the line of turf along the cliff top, the benches placed at intervals, and the little square plots where the staircases descended to the beach. I saw Trafalgar Lodge very plainly. It was a red brick villa with a veranda, a tennis lawn behind, and a front garden full of marguerites and scraggy geraniums. From a flagstaff, an enormous Union Jack hung limply in the still air. Presently, someone left the house and sauntered along the cliff. Through my glasses, I saw it was an old man wearing white flannel trousers, a blue serge jacket, and a straw hat. He carried field glasses and a newspaper. He sat on one of the iron seats, reading, and occasionally turning his glasses on the sea. He watched the destroyer for a long time. I watched him for half an hour until he returned to the house for lunch. I wasn't feeling very confident. This decent, commonplace dwelling was not what I had expected. The man might be the bald archaeologist from that horrible moorland farm, or he might not. He was exactly the kind of satisfied old bird you find in every suburb. If you wanted a type of perfectly harmless person, you would probably pick him. But after lunch, as I sat on the hotel porch, I perked up. I saw the thing I had hoped for and dreaded to miss. A yacht came up from the south and dropped anchor opposite the Rough. She seemed about 150 tons, and I saw from the white ensign that she belonged to the squadron. Scaife and I went down to the harbour and hired a boatman for an afternoon's fishing. We caught about 20 pounds of cod and lythe, and out on that dancing blue sea, I took a cheerier view of things. Above the white cliffs, I saw the green and red of the villas, and especially the great flagstaff of Trafalgar Lodge. About 4 o'clock, I had the boatman row us around the yacht. She lay like a delicate white bird, ready to flee at a moment's notice. Her name was the Ariadne. I spoke to one of the men polishing brasswork and got an answer in the soft dialect of Essex. Another hand passed the time of day in unmistakable English. Then the men suddenly ignored us and bent to their work as an officer came along the deck. He was a pleasant, clean-looking young fellow, and he asked about our fishing in very good English. But there was no doubt about him. His close-cropped head and the cut of his collar never came out of England. That reassured me, but as we rowed back to Bradgate, my obstinate doubts returned. My enemies knew I had gotten my information from Scudder, and Scudder had given me the clue to this place. If they knew Scudder had this clue, wouldn't they change their plans? Too much depended on their success to take risks. I wondered if the man from the night before had recognized me. Somehow I didn't think so, and I clung to that hope. But the business had never seemed so difficult as it did that afternoon. By all calculations, I should have been rejoicing in success. I spent an hour or two watching Trafalgar Lodge from the garden of the empty house next door. I had a full view of the court where two figures were playing tennis. One was the old man I had seen earlier. The other was a younger fellow wearing a club scarf around his waist. They played with tremendous zest, like two city gents wanting hard exercise. You couldn't conceive a more innocent spectacle. They shouted and laughed and stopped for drinks when a maid brought out tankards on a tray. I rubbed my eyes. Was I the greatest fool on earth? Mystery and darkness had hung about the men who hunted me over the Scotch moors. It was easy to connect them with the knife that killed Scudder and with designs on the world's peace. But here were two guileless citizens taking their exercise, soon to go indoors to a humdrum dinner and talk of market prices and cricket scores. I had built a net to catch vultures, and lo and behold, two plump thrushes had blundered into it. Presently a third figure arrived, a young man on a bicycle with golf clubs on his back. He strolled to the lawn and was welcomed riotously. They chaffed him, and it sounded horribly English. Then the plump man, mopping his brow, announced he needed a bath. "I've got into a proper lather," I heard him say. "This will bring down my weight and my handicap, Bob. I'll take you tomorrow and give you a stroke." You couldn't find anything more English than that. They went into the house, leaving me feeling like an idiot. I had been barking up the wrong tree. These men might be acting, but where was their audience? They didn't know I was sitting 30 yards away in a rhododendron bush. It was impossible to believe these three hearty fellows were anything but what they seemed, ordinary, game-playing, suburban Englishmen. And yet, there were three of them. One was old, one was plump, and one was lean and dark. Their house matched Scudder's notes, and 1/2 a mile off lay a steam yacht with at least one German officer. I thought of Carolides lying dead, of all Europe trembling on the edge of an earthquake, and the men in London waiting anxiously. There was no doubt that hell was afoot somewhere. The Black Stone had won, and if it survived this June night, it would bank its winnings. There seemed only one thing to do: go forward as if I had no doubts. If I was going to make a fool of myself, I would do it handsomely. Never in my life have I faced a job with greater reluctance. I would rather have walked into a den of anarchists or faced a charging lion with a popgun than enter that happy home of three cheerful Englishmen and tell them their game was up. How they would laugh at me! But suddenly I remembered something I once heard in Rhodesia from old Peter Pienaar. Peter was the best scout I ever knew. He had a theory about disguises. He said that barring fingerprints, physical traits were little use for identification if the fugitive really knew his business. He laughed at dyed hair and false beards. The only thing that mattered was what Peter called atmosphere. If a man could enter surroundings perfectly different from where he was first observed, and, this is the important part, really play up to those surroundings, he would puzzle the cleverest detectives on earth. Peter used to tell a story of how he once borrowed a black coat, went to church, and shared a hymn book with a man looking for him. If that man had seen him in decent company before, he would have recognized him. But he had only ever seen Peter snuffing the lights in a public house with a revolver. Recalling Peter's talk gave me the first real comfort I'd had that day. Peter was a wise old bird, and these fellows were the pick of the flock. What if they were playing Peter's game? A fool tries to look different. A clever man looks the same and is different. There was another maxim of Peter's: if you are playing a part, you will never keep it up unless you convince yourself that you are it. That explained the tennis. Those chaps didn't need to act. They just turned a handle and passed into another life. It was now nearly 8 o'clock. I gave Scaife his instructions on how to place his men, then went for a walk. I went round the deserted golf course and to a point on the cliffs beyond the villas. On the trim roads, I met people in flannels coming back from the beach. Out at sea in the blue dusk, lights appeared on the Ariadne and the Destroyer. The whole scene was so peaceful and ordinary that my spirits sank. It took all my resolution to stroll toward Trafalgar Lodge about 9:30. On the way, I found comfort in the sight of a greyhound running at a nursemaid's heels. He reminded me of a dog I used to hunt with in the Polly Hills. We were after Reebok, a dun-coloured buck. I remembered following one beast, only for both the dog and me to lose it completely. A greyhound works by sight, and my eyes are good enough, but that buck simply leaked out of the landscape. Against the grey rock, it showed no more than a crow against a thundercloud. It didn't need to run away. It just stood still and melted into the background. Suddenly, the moral struck me. The Black Stone didn't need to bolt. They were quietly absorbed into the landscape. I was on the right track. I jammed that thought down in my mind and vowed not to forget it. The last word was with Peter Pienaar. Scaife's men would be posted now, but there was no sign of a soul. The house stood open for anyone to observe. A low railing separated it from the cliff road. The ground-floor windows were open. Shaded lights and the low sound of voices revealed the occupants finishing dinner. Everything was as public and above-board as a charity bazaar. Feeling the greatest fool on earth, I opened the gate and rang the bell. A man like me, who has travelled the rough places of the world, gets on perfectly well with the upper crust and the working man. I understand them, and they understand me. I was at home with herdsmen and tramps, and sufficiently at ease with high officials like Sir Walter. But what fellows like me don't understand is the great, comfortable, satisfied middle class, the folk who live in villas and suburbs. I don't know how they look at things. I don't understand their conventions. I am as shy of them as I am of a black mamba. When a trim parlour-maid opened the door, I could hardly find my voice. I asked for Mr. Appleton and was ushered in. My plan had been to walk straight into the dining-room and shock the men into a recognition that would confirm my theory. But the hall mastered me. It was filled with golf clubs, tennis rackets, straw hats, and rows of gloves, the gear you find in 10,000 British homes. A grandfather clock ticked. A barometer hung on the wall. The place was as orthodox as a church. When the maid asked for my name, I gave it automatically and was shown into the smoking-room. It was even worse. Framed photographs of college teams lined the mantelpiece. I managed to pull myself together and follow the maid, but I was too late. She had already announced it to me, and I missed the chance to see their initial reaction. When I walked into the dining-room, the old man at the head of the table rose to meet me. He was in an evening dress, as was the plump one. The third, the dark fellow, wore a blue serge suit and a club tie. The old man's manner was perfect. "Mr. Hannay," he said hesitatingly, "did you wish to see me? One moment, you fellows, and I'll rejoin you. We had better go to the smoking-room." Though I hadn't an ounce of confidence, I forced myself to play the game. I pulled up a chair and sat down. "I think we have met before," I said, "and I guess you know my business." The light was dim, but their faces played the part of mystification well. "Maybe, the old man said. "I haven't a very good memory, but you must tell me your errand, sir, for I really don't know it." "Well, then," I said, sounding foolish to my own ears, "I have come to tell you that the game is up. I have a warrant for the arrest of you 3 gentlemen." "Arrest?" The old man looked genuinely shocked. "Good God, what for?" "For the murder of Franklin Scudder in London on the 23rd of last month." "I never heard the name before," he said in a dazed voice. One of the others spoke up. "That was the Portland Place murder. I read about it." "Good heavens, you must be mad, sir. Where do you come from?" "Scotland Yard," I said. Silence followed. The old man stared at his plate, fumbling with a nut, the very model of innocent bewilderment. Then the plump one spoke, stammering a little. "Don't get flustered, uncle. It is a ridiculous mistake, but we can easily set it right. I can show that I was out of the country on the 23rd, and Bob was in a nursing home. You were in London, but you can explain what you were doing." The old man was looking at me with blazing eyes. "He is safe," he cried. "You cannot follow in time. He is gone. He has triumphed. Der Schwarzstein ist in der Siege skrown." There was more in those eyes than common triumph. They had been hooded like a bird of prey, and now they flamed with a hawk's pride. A white fanatic heat burned in them, and I realized for the first time the terrible thing I had been up against. This man was more than a spy. In his foul way, he was a patriot. As the handcuffs clinked on his wrists, I said my last word to him. "I hope Franz will bear his triumph well. I ought to tell you that the Ariadne has been in our hands for the last hour. 7 weeks later, as all the world knows, we went to war. I joined the new army the first week, but I think I had done my best service before I ever put on khaki.